Tato, I always thought that was the best theme tune that we ever had. Good morning, welcome to Morning Report. It's Tuesday, April the 1st. I'm Geoff Robinson. Simon Mersip's with me here in the Wellington studio today. And on the programme, the International Court of Justice orders Japan to stop whaling in the Antarctic with immediate effect.
And also today, in case you don't know, it's Geoff's last day on Morning Report and at Radio New Zealand. Generations of New Zealanders have woken up to his kia ora tato, Good Morning New Zealand, since this programme first went to air in 1975.
Good morning, Geoff Robinson and Peter Fry with Morning Report. In today's programme, another bomb hits Britain's rail services. The President of the Lebanon resigns. We talk to Hugh Watt about his resignation and look at the work of the Prime Minister's think tank. But first, the bulletin. Peter Fry.
Well, so throughout the show today, we'll bring you highlights of Geoff's 44-year career with Radio New Zealand. Japan says it's disappointed the International Court of Justice has ruled its whaling in the Southern Ocean is not a scientific program. The court, which sits in The Hague, has ruled Japan should stop its whaling program with immediate effect and cease granting new permits for the killing, taking and treating of whales. The spokesperson for Japan's delegation in The Hague is Mr. Nori Shikata. I asked him what the decision means for his country's whaling practices.
We are disappointed and regret that the court ruled that Japan's research whaling program in the Antarctic did not fall within the special permit clause of the treaty. However, Japan will abide by the judgment of the court as a state that places a great importance on the international legal order and rule of law as a basis of the international community.
And when you say abide by it, this means an immediate stop to whaling?
Regarding the content of the judgment, we have to study very carefully, and during days and weeks to come back in Japan, we will consider our future course of action. But one thing which is clear is that we are saying that we are going to abide by the decision of the court.
And that's Nori Shikata, spokesperson for Japan's delegation in The Hague. We'll have more on this story throughout Morning Report today. It's 6:12.
The police have more clues into Auckland woman Sissy Chen's death after confirming bones found in a park drain were hers. Her skull and bones from her torso and leg were found in a North Shore park last week, more than a year after she vanished from her Torbay home. Our reporter Nicole Pryor went to the scene.
I'm here at Totara Vale Park and it's early evening. There's a children's playground here, a flying fox and a walking track which goes through the middle. Sissy Chen used to walk here often. It's very quiet at the park with the occasional person walking through. Neighbours say it's very quiet for this time of year and has basically been deserted since police started investigating the scene.
It's quite eerie because every time I've gone back there's been nobody there.
My kids, one's 9, one's almost 9, one's 7, and that's pretty disturbing. They were playing by the willow tree and in that park here by the flying fox, so it's not very pleasant.
It really hasn't fazed us at all. We're really quite pleased actually that the body has been identified and that it will bring closure to her family.
Right now we're just using the other park, just to be sure.
Detective Inspector Bruce Scott says the family is relieved but upset.
They're very disappointed, obviously, to learn that their sister and daughter have been found dead. They've always held hope that something positive might come of it, but they're very pleased, obviously, to have Sissy back.
Bruce Scott says police now hope to complete the case quickly.
Some of the witnesses that we've previously talked to, we're going back to get more information. We've got quite a bit of work to do now.
Detective Inspector Bruce Scott says the breakthrough has helped the investigation. In Auckland for Morning Report, Nicole Pryor.
It's 6:14. We're very pleased you're with us this morning because we are today looking back today at Geoff's career on Morning Report and at Radio New Zealand. Geoff joined the then New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation in 1970 and first appeared on Morning Report on June the 6th, 1975.
This is Morning Report on the national programme and it's 7:05.
On that day, he was just filling in.
If you're wondering what's happened to Joe Cote this morning, well, Joe's taken 3 weeks holiday. Lucky fellow, he's off around the flesh pots of Europe. So I've had to get up in the middle of the night and come in and do morning report for you. My name's Geoff Robinson, and I normally do midday and evening reports.
But it wasn't long before Geoff was presenting morning report full-time.
There's no doubt about it. He has been a consistent.
Now, since that day in 1976, Geoff has been the voice of Morning Report, and Clark Isaac has been writing radio reviews for the Otago Daily Times for 45 years. He told our Otago reporter Ian Telfer that with Geoff's retirement, a rare talent is leaving the microphone.
There's no doubt about it. He has been a consistent performer. He's equable, he's even-handed. That is a great plus in any broadcaster.
He calls that just good manners.
So be it, yes, good-mannered. Many radio exponents, I suppose, over the years have been far from good-mannered. Particularly, perhaps on commercial radio, you get men and women who are out to make an impression. They pull out the stops, perhaps not in the right way.
Is there still a place for Geoff Robinson's style?
Definitely. In a society which becomes fragmented quite often, I think that a person like a Geoff, with a steady approach, is a definite plus.
It's a passing of an era to some extent, the gentleman of broadcasting.
That is right to a certain extent, but I'm sure that we will probably see in his successors a different style.
And we younger broadcasters who have to carry on from Geoff, we should take a leaf out of his book.
Definitely, yes.
That's Clark Isaac of the Otago Daily Times speaking with our reporter Ian Telfer. Now, we have Geoff. Now, you haven't taken a little rest while I read all this out to you here, but we have...
I've just got to sit and suffer.
Sit and suffer. We've had many, many emails, hundreds and hundreds of them over the last while. I'm just going to give you an example of just a few. Dear Geoff Robinson, for thousands of hours of enlightenment, entertainment, and above all, an even-handed approach to everything, we are very grateful. Indeed, thanks. And enjoy the golf. Molly and Gordon Cooper. This from Joan Jenkin. Best wishes for your retirement, Geoff, although I don't know what I shall do in the mornings now. Thank you for the best mornings a person could have. You will certainly be sorely missed by a multitude of listeners. All the best. And another one, thank you, Geoff, for setting the highest benchmark of New Zealand journalism. Your professionalism, equanimity and the high regard shown to all those you speak with or report on is a privilege for listeners to share. That from Jenny Peters. And I think there's many more like it, Geoff.
Well, thank you. It's very humbling. It's a privilege to receive them. Thank you very much. But we've got to get on with the programme.
We do.
17 past 6. Top stories this morning. The investigation into the death of Sissy Chen continues.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says New Zealand is poorly prepared for worsening floods.
More people are planning to go bankrupt in order to avoid paying off student loans.
And Japan is ordered to stop all whaling in the Antarctic.
I'm absolutely over the moon for all those people who wanted to see the charade of scientific whaling cease for once and for all.
We'll be talking to Sea Shepherd about the decision before 7 here on Morning Report. It's 17 past 6 now. We'll go to the Pacific News with Sally Rowand. Talofa lava, Sally.
Thanks, Simon. Kia ora. Fiji's government says it's pleased with the decision of the Australian and New Zealand governments to lift all existing sanctions against Fiji. In a statement, it says it's always believed the sanctions were ill-conceived and served only to discourage talented and qualified individuals from serving the Fijian people. New Zealand has followed Australia in announcing a formal lifting of the travel ban against certain members of the governing regime and the military, which was introduced after the December 2006 coup. Fiji says it looks forward to working with Australia and New Zealand. The United Front for a Democratic Fiji says while Australia and New Zealand eagerly remove their effective travel restrictions on the regime, they remain oblivious and detached from the realities on the ground in Fiji. The opposition grouping says there are clear cases of manipulation and deception, including the use by the regime leader of the country's coat of arms as his party logo. The group has filed a complaint with the police against Rear Admiral Frank Bainimarama, saying he has flouted one of his regime's own decrees. The UFDF's Mick Beddoes says the Rear Admiral, who's standing for election this year, should be held accountable for campaigning and appointing candidates before his party has been registered as required under the law.
If the police is acting independently, they probably would be interested to investigate and take appropriate action. If they don't, and nothing much happens to it, then the reverse is what they're confirming, that there is no independent, impartial institution acting in the best interests of the people.
Mick Beddoes of the United Front for a Democratic Fiji. Tonga's Justice Minister, Clive Edwards, has warned the country's police ministry and its Auditor-General over leaking information about passports. The warnings come following reports that a confidential immigration audit report presented to the Tongan government last year found dozens of passports were issued to Chinese nationals who the audit office believes were not entitled to them. According to Tonga's Kaniva News, Mr Edwards also implied that Australia and New Zealand might be involved in the leaks, saying they wanted access to Tongan Foreign Ministry records. Mr Edwards says leaking the documents was inappropriate and illegal. A police commander in Papua New Guinea has been arrested after accusations of police brutality. Senior Inspector John Tarua and 4 other members of the police force face charges after dozens of men from a settlement in the capital, Port Moresby, were allegedly slashed with knives while being arrested last year. It's alleged last May the officers used their knives against the men, cutting their Achilles tendons and stealing personal items after being sent to disarm them. The 75 men had been involved in an ethnic clash with a group from a neighbouring settlement. And before we go, a few bars from the traditional Fijian farewell, Isa Lei, to both Geoff and Simon, sung by our new reporter, Indira Mawala.
Isa, Isa, pulangilah sadina, domula ko ang nararawakina, thaba meka ko ang maidagaba, domula ko ang nasinganilasa, Isa Lei nanongurarawa, niko sana vondo ina mataka, bang nanuma nanona tolasa, mai suba nanumati konga.
The final verse of Isa Lei, farewelling you, Geoff and Simon, ending the Pacific News from Radio New Zealand International.
That was lovely. That was the first to me. I've never been serenaded on the wireless before.
It was beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much indeed. 6:22, here's Penny Mackay with the rural news.
Kia ora, good morning. Concerns about toxic chemicals and fracking waste entering the food chain has prompted the government to issue new advice to regional councils. Fracking waste has controversially been disposed on farmland in Taranaki, where the regional council has issued consents for it to go on one of its so-called land farms and other sites. The government's new guidelines do not support that practice, but it's leaving it up to regional councils to decide whether or not to follow best practice. Benedict Collins has more.
The Ministry for the Environment has released voluntary guidelines for regional councils when it comes to hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which is the process of blasting water and chemicals at high pressure into the earth to access fossil fuels. The guidelines do not support the disposal of fracking waste on land. Instead, they say best practice is for regional councils to ensure fracking waste is sent to industrial waste management facilities, recycled or disposed of far below the Earth's surface, a practice known as deep well reinjection. The Environment Minister Amy Adams says concerns about the toxicity of the waste, livestock and food safety all played a part in the new recommendation.
Well, I think that's part of the reason why the guidelines recommend that it's not an endorsed practice, is because of the concerns around how you can then control the subsequent use of that land and how that waste could enter either the food chain or the waterways and the like. So that's part of the thinking that went into the recommendation that it wasn't an endorsed practice.
Environment Minister Amy Adams. The Green Party's new Plymouth candidate Sarah Roberts says the new guidelines are a good start.
Well, while the move away from the land farming of the fracking waste vindicates what we've been saying all along, the land farming of the equally toxic drilling waste in huge quantities should not be occurring either on our prime agricultural land. And it's a huge concern in Taranaki that these oil and gas well sites are dotted all over our dairy supply farms.
This is Benedict Collins.
Public Health says there could be dozens of people who've become ill with Campylobacter, the source of which has been traced to a Timaru farm selling raw milk under the branding of Village Milk. There are 7 confirmed cases, but the South Canterbury Medical Officer of Health, Daniel Williams, says those are only the people who went to their GP. He says in a situation such as this, they're usually the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Williams says raw milk is a very effective conduit for bugs.
We have in the past had outbreaks of other bacteria. We've had cases of E. coli which were also linked to drinking raw milk. Raw milk can be contaminated with any of the bugs that live in a cow's gut. And if people really want to drink raw milk, they can reduce the risk of getting sick by heating it. If you heat milk to 70 degrees for a minute, then that will kill most of the bugs that are likely to make people sick. Essentially, it is a high-risk product, and drinking it without treating it with heat is a dangerous thing to do.
But the Chief Executive Officer of the Village Milk Company, Mark Houston, could not disagree more, saying raw milk handled properly is a very safe product.
Generally, milk comes out of the cow's udder with absolutely no bugs in it. It's pristine at that stage, and it's only contamination that happens after that that is a problem with health for people. We've been selling milk for nearly 3 years, and we've sold 330,000 litres. No cases of illness whatsoever. In effect, we've probably had hundreds of cases of people's health improving.
Mr. Houston also says heating the milk ruins its nutritional value. He says inconsistent test results of the milk produced by the Timaru farm indicates the source of the Campylobacter may not be mishandling at all, but come from something outside the control of the farmers. The Ministry for Primary Industries is continuing to investigate, and the raw milk operation at the farm will remain closed in the meantime. The demand for New Zealand lamb overseas is strong for most cuts, and an analyst with NZX Agrifax, Nick Handley, says with lamb supply constrained, the ongoing returns to farmers should be good.
Most items of the carcass are in good demand, except for the high-value bone-in middle cuts, which remain under more pressure than other parts of the carcass. At the same time, those shoulder cuts are selling well at the moment, and pricing has improved further, boosted by demand out of the Middle East and from China. And as we head into the winter production period, markets are in a much better position than a year ago. For example, UK leg returns are about 30% higher than they were at this time last year.
Nick Handley says in the beef market, the higher Kiwi dollar is eating into exporters' returns, but he says there are developments in Asian markets.
Import permits for the second quarter of 2014 are in the process of being released in Indonesia, and this confirms that the revived trade with this market will at least continue for the next few months.
Nick Handley. And that's the rural news for this morning. Ka kite anō.
Penny, thank you very much for that. It's 6:27 on Morning Report. Time now for Te Manu Kōrehi News. Ane a Eru Rerekura.
Mō atararau, ane ngā kauinga kōrero mō te tuatahi o ngā rā o Paenga Whawha. A Ngaitahu mutton bird is confident all the titi they harvest are safe to eat, even though a scientist wants to test feathers for radiation. Researchers at Auckland University want to see if the sooty shearwater birds have been affected by fallout from the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan that was damaged by a deadly tsunami 3 years ago. Titi or mutton birds spend their winter off the coast of Japan, many of them feeding in the waters off Fukushima. Preliminary tests conducted last year by Te Papa and Landcare Research confirmed the birds were safe to eat. The upoko or head of Te Runanga o Waihopai, Michael Skerritt, agrees with the preliminary results and says people have nothing to worry about.
When they migrate here from the Northern Hemisphere, they fly 9 days, 1,000 k's a day. I don't think any affected by radiation would have any show of making it here. And I think those tests that were done last year would back that up.
Michael Skerritt of Ngaitahu. The United Nations says climate change would affect Māori on many levels and in different ways. The headline summary is that natural systems worldwide are bearing the brunt of rising temperatures right now, but scientists fear a growing impact on people's health, homes, food and safety. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also devotes a few paragraphs to Māori. It notes land in the east and north is prone to flooding and sediment running off whenua and into streams, two factors which are increasing uncertainty for farming. Out at sea, UN scientists say the fisheries and aquaculture sector faces substantial risks and uncertainties from changes in ocean temperature. The report states changes in natural ecosystems would challenge some Māori to cope and adapt. The panel suggests combining traditional ways and knowledge with new and untried policies and strategies to ensure long-term sustainability of climate-sensitive Māori communities. Day 2 of an environmental court hearing into the Crown acquisition of ancestral Māori land for a major roading project is being held in Wellington. The Māori novelist Patricia Grace says the taking of a portion of her Waikanai land for the multi-million-dollar Kapiti Expressway isn't fair, sound or necessary for the project. The Transport Agency has already begun building work on part of the expressway. Iwi leaders and government officials will gather in Te Awamutu today to commemorate 150 years since the Battle of Ōrākau in the Waikato War. About 150 Māori and 17 British troops died during the battle in the mid-1860s. Ōrākau brought iwi together under the mantle of the kingitanga to defend their sovereignty. The Waiariki MP Te Ururo Flavel says the war was significant for his own people and for those iwi who gave help and assistance to Ngāti Maniapoto, Tainui Whānui and Tūhoe. He says the battle was huge in terms of developing relationships between tribes. Mr Flavel says it's important conflicts that have happened in New Zealand are commemorated as much as those that occurred overseas. That's Te Manu Kōrehi News for now. I'll have a further bulletin just before 9.
You're listening to Morning Report on Radio New Zealand National with Simon Mossip and Geoff Robinson. It's 29 to 7.
And this morning, the United Nations highest court orders Japan to stop whaling in the Antarctic.
In business news, we'll analyse Xero's new alliance with KPMG.
And of course today, Geoff retires from Radio New Zealand. Geoff first appeared on Morning Report on June the 6th in 1975. Since then, among other things, he's been a stickler for details and keeping his co-presenters in check.
Good morning, welcome to Morning Report. He's Geoff Robinson, I'm Sean Plunket. It is Friday, the 8th of March.
No, it's not. It's at least the 10th, I think.
It's the 10th. That is the 10th of March, sorry.
Right. I don't think that's quite happened to me, but you never know, there's still time. Stay with us as we look back.
The International Court of Justice has ruled Japan must stop all whaling in the Antarctic with immediate effect. The decision was made after Australia brought the legal challenge against Japan, and it was the first time any country had used an international court to try to stop whaling. The court, which sits in The Hague, has ruled Japan should, as well as stopping whaling, cease granting new permits for the killing, taking and treating of whales. Australia's former Environment Minister Peter Garrett, who helped launch the legal action, says he feels vindicated.
I'm absolutely over the moon for all those people who wanted to see the charade of scientific whaling cease for once and for all, and to have this ruling from the International Court vindicates the decision that we took in taking Japan to the court.
Now, clashes between Japan's whaling fleet and Sea Shepherd activists have become a dramatic staple of the Southern Hemisphere summer in recent years. Sea Shepherd's Global Executive Officer Alex Cornelissen has been at the trial at The Hague. He joins us now from there. And Mr Cornelissen, what was the reaction of you and your team when you read the decision?
Yeah, we were very happy, of course, that the outcome was so positive in favour of Australia and in favour of the whales, of course.
Is it an absolute victory?
Well, pretty much the court ruled on every count in favour of Australia, and it was not just a very tight decision, it was a 12-4 decision. So it was a clear statement that the international community was pretty much fed up with the sham that Japan has been conducting over the last couple of decades.
It's the ruling is some 70 pages long. There are no loopholes in it that you're aware of?
No, this ruling is binding, and Japan has already announced that they will abide by the court's ruling. Of course, they can develop a new scientific research program, but then they still would have to comply with the international regulations, and I think that's very unlikely, especially considering the fact that their current scientific research program, JARPA 2, does not comply with those regulations. So I think they'll be hard-pressed to get any scientific plan through at this stage. So I think it's pretty much over. It looks like we're going to be doing something else this coming December.
Indeed, that's a good question. What will the Sea Shepherd organisation do?
Yeah, of course, there's a lot of campaigns that we can still do. There's a lot of whaling still happening in the world. So if this indeed is the end of Japanese whaling, then we'll refocus our attention either to the northern whaling of Japan or perhaps to the Atlantic Ocean, where both Iceland and Norway still conduct whaling.
All right, thank you very much for that to Sea Shepherd's Global Executive Officer Alex Cornelissen. He was in The Hague where the decision for the International Court was released. It's 20 to 7 now. Well, as you probably know, doubtless know, today is Geoff Robinson's last day on Morning Report. He started at the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation in 1970, became one of the hosts of Morning Report in 1976. We'll be featuring highlights of Geoff's career at Radio New Zealand throughout the programme today. But first, this report, compiled by Kim Griggs.
Kia ora tata, good morning, welcome to Morning Report.
Generations of New Zealanders have woken to Geoff Robinson's Kia ora tato since the Morning Report first went to air in 1975. He's been at the helm for many of the major news stories over the past 4 decades and was on air from 5 o'clock the morning of the 9/11 terrorism attacks.
There have been unprecedented attacks with 4 planes hijacked and 3 of them deliberately crashed into New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Loss of life is expected to be catastrophic from the subsequent collapse of the 2 towers of the centre where many thousands of people work.
The morning after the Christchurch earthquake, Geoff introduced Radio New Zealand's coverage like this.
And there's only one story today on the programme, the aftermath of the earthquake in Christchurch. We'll be talking to the rescue authorities, to the Prime Minister, the police and the people of a city which is still, of course, trying to recover from the earlier earthquake last September. It's a scene of devastation down there. We'll bring the information about rescues and the death toll, sadly, as the programme continues.
He's been the voice of Radio New Zealand for many of the country's other never-to-be-forgotten moments.
2 explosions rocked the ship and she sank at her berth at Marsden Wharf. A member of the crew was missing after the sinking and his body was found by police divers late this morning. The Rainbow Warrior was due to sail in a few days for Mururoa on a Greenpeace
Wreckage
mission.
has been sighted in the Antarctica on a location which indicates Mount Erebus.
People in Aramoana near Dunedin are waking this morning to a tragedy which hit the tiny township last night, leaving at least 2 dead, several missing, feared dead.
Clark Isaac has been writing a weekly radio review for the Otago Daily Times for the past 45 years. He says a rare talent is departing the microphone.
The great thing about him is that he seems to be calm all the time. He's equable, he's even-handed, and I think that is a great plus in any broadcaster, even-handedness.
Geoff Robinson says the job has been an absolute privilege.
You are talking to people who ordinary folks don't get to meet, but you're doing it on behalf of them. You're the first person to hear a lot of the news that goes on in the world, which is always an exciting position to be. And you're right in people's heads and homes with the information you do. So it's been a privilege as well as a pleasure.
Geoff Robinson hopes listeners will remember him with fondness and not too much annoyance. For Morning Report, Kim Griggs.
And we will have more highlights from Geoff's career throughout Morning Report today. It's 17 to 7.
Top stories this morning. The International Court of Justice says Japan must immediately stop all whaling in the Antarctic.
Police will re-interview witnesses in relation to the death of Sissy Chen.
A report finds New Zealand's unprepared for an expected increase in floods, droughts and wildfires.
And Xero discusses its new alliance with KPMG in Britain.
The UK is a very big opportunity for Xero, so to get a very credible player on board does demonstrate a real commitment.
We'll have more from Xero's Rod Drury in Business News shortly. 16 to 7 now. Let's have a look first at the newspapers this morning.
The New Zealand Herald leads with the headline, Breakthrough in Cold Case Killing. The paper says the remains of Auckland accountant Sissy Chen have been confirmed as those discovered in a drain on the North Shore. The paper says the 44-year-old went missing 16 months ago. In other news, a member of Tēnā Pōra's legal team has told the paper the 38-year-old is looking forward to some basic freedoms, such as going fishing when he's released on parole.
The Waikato Times features a large photograph of Christchurch woman Amy Farrell, who was found dead in the boot of her car in a supermarket car park. The paper says the man at the centre of the inquiry into an attack on 2 hitchhikers and the death of Ms Farrell had been out of prison for 6 months and was still on parole. And the paper says royal fever is brewing in Cambridge, with many locals scheming up ways to catch a glimpse of William and Catherine when they hit the town on April the 12th.
The Dominion Post leads with the headline, Parole Inquiry After Attacks. The paper says Corrections has launched an inquiry into the department's supervision of the man at the centre of the police investigation into the death of Amy Farrell and an attack on 2 hitchhikers. And the paper reports that an important Maori treasure was withdrawn from Te Papa by 2 members of Wellington's prominent Love family so they could sell it.
In Christchurch, the press has more on the death of Amy Farrell and the attack on 2 West Coast hitchhikers, crimes the police believe are linked. The paper has a photograph of police forensic experts searching for clues at a Wildberry Road property in Walston. In other news, the paper says Japan is set to face new curbs on its annual slaughter of whales in the Southern Ocean. Last night, of course, the International Court of Justice at The Hague ruled the slaughter was not for scientific purposes as claimed.
The Otago Daily Times reports on how a prime Queenstown waterfront site, once occupied by stables, could be used for a $6 million 3-storey retail development. And the paper says Dunedin residents could soon be paying for water every time they turn on a tap, after the council installed a trial batch of water meters. That's some of what's in the papers today. There's some traffic news. Just from the Auckland motorways, on the northern it's heavy between Otaha Valley Road and Constellation Drive, and again at Tristram Avenue. Southern's heavy in the usual places between Drury and Takanini. It's moderate through Manukau. And the northwestern heavy at Lincoln Road for those heading into the city.
Jeff, you must be pleased you've never had to negotiate that Auckland traffic in the time you've been hosting Morning Report.
There's not a lot of traffic when I drive to work, I must say. Anyway, it's 14 to 7 now and time for the business news. Here's Sharon Brett Kelly. Morning, Sharon.
Morning, good morning. Coming up, the economy may be running out of slack. Xero enters an exclusive deal with KPMG in Britain, and comments by the Fed chief boost Wall Street. Businesses continue to feel confident about their prospects, but there may not be much slack in the economy's capacity by the middle of the year. ANZ's monthly business confidence survey shows a net 67% of firms are optimistic about general prospects in March. That's down 4 points on February, but still at an elevated level. Confidence across all major sectors is above 50, which signals a broad-based expansion. The bank's composite growth measure, which combines business and consumer confidence, signals the potential for annual economic growth of around 6% by mid-year. But ANZ's chief economist Cameron Bagri says the economy doesn't have the capacity to grow that fast.
So if I have a look at general business confidence, it's up around the sort of top 5% of outcomes we've seen historically. In fact, across the board, firms' own activity expectations, expected profitability, employment intentions, all those sort of ground indicators, sitting up at exceptionally high levels compared to what we've seen, compared to the historical averages. So by and large, the economy's still got a pretty firm spring-up step. On the face of it, the survey suggests we could be getting 6% growth. Now, I still think that's pie in the sky sort of stuff, but you step back and I guess the underlying message here is that things look pretty good.
Does the survey indicate that businesses are now factoring, or have probably already started to factor in these well-signalled interest rate hikes?
We've seen that story for, the last sort of 3 months because, the interest rate hike we saw in March was pretty well flagged over the preceding sort of couple of months. So if we go back, last month, there was something like 90% of the survey respondents expected interest rates to move up. There's still a fair chunk of survey respondents expect interest rates to move up from here. And I guess respondents are looking through those prospects for high interest rates. They're looking through the fact that the New Zealand dollar is a little bit more elevated, and they're stepping back and looking at the sort of broader picture, and they're still coming to the conclusion that life's pretty good out there on the period.
ANZ's chief economist Cameron Bagri talking to Kate Gudsell. Xero's new alliance with one of the world's 4 largest accounting firms, KPMG in Britain, involves a period of exclusive marketing, but Xero is still able to deal with other accounting firms. Under the alliance, KPMG will launch a new division from May to provide services to small to medium-sized businesses using Xero's software and cloud computing. The British chairman of KPMG, Simon Collins, says Xero is an impressive software platform which will support his firm's delivery of services to a part of the market where technology is increasingly transforming the way people do business. Xero's managing director and founder Rod Drury says his company's strategy in Britain mirrors what it's done in other markets.
So we've been executing this sort of plan in each market. So we've worked with most of the big 4 in New Zealand and Australia now, and you might remember last year we won a big partnership in Australia with Deloitte Partners. What's happened with Deloitte in New Zealand is they've actually acquired 2 of our top accounting partners because the metrics of those companies are so good. So I think with the credibility we're getting in the Australia and New Zealand marketplace, we're able to reference those when firms overseas are looking at their strategies for small business, and I think that's helping. So this, again, will be another clear signal that helps us out in the big US market as well.
Xero's Rod Drury. The head of wealth management at Craig's Investment Partners, Mark Lister, says the KPMG alliance is yet another endorsement of Xero's software.
It is, of course, early days and difficult to quantify given the fact that we don't have a lot of information. But look, it's certainly a real positive, and I think the UK is a very big market and a very big opportunity for Xero. So to get a very credible player on board in terms of an alliance like this does demonstrate a real commitment from KPMG and I guess endorses the quality of product and the offering. So certainly a positive announcement to be made.
Doesn't seem to be reflected in the Xero share price, however.
No, the share price is off a little bit today, and it has weakened quite a bit in the last week or two. It's probably off 10% or a little bit higher than that. Look, I think it's just following a global trend where we have seen a lot of the stocks in the technology space, particularly the ones that have rallied very strongly. Think of stocks like Twitter or Facebook or Netflix in the US. They've all come off the boil quite a lot in the last several weeks. Some of them are off as much as 30%. So I think you are just seeing a bit of the money come out of that space globally. Xero's following that trend in this part of the world, despite the fact that markets are up quite strongly in Asia and Australia.
Craig's Mark Lister talking to our business editor Jenny Ruth. Most analysts are recommending investors buy shares in Genesis Energy, emphasising their high yield. The shares will yield a gross 11.3% annualised through to June this year, a gross 14.3% in the year ending June 2015, and the bonus shares offered to retail shareholders who will hold on to the stock for at least a year will boost the 12-month return by 6.7%. Most analysts also value the shares above the $1.55 price the government has set. Edison, for example, values the shares between $1.75 and $2.04, while Fat Profit's midpoint valuation is $1.75. An analyst at Woodward Partners, Joe Cote, says the offer presents excellent value.
We've titled our report Compelling Value, which is a reflection of our assessment of the underlying value of Genesis compared to the offer price. We pitch a range of 166 through to 193 with a midpoint valuation, which is our assessment of fair value of 175. For investors, shareholder returns are core to the investment case. There are a couple of aspects to the offer which are highly attractive to investors, the least of which, of course, is the offer price. But the bonus share component, the 12-month return on that aspect, is very attractive and goes some way towards mitigating some of the downside risk that could come. It is a 6.7% equivalent return for 12 months, which, as I say, is highly attractive to retail investors.
Woodward Partners analyst Joe Cote. Housing construction looks set to get underway in the areas that need it the most. Official figures show the number of new homes, including apartments, fell a seasonally adjusted 1.7% last month compared with January. Excluding apartments, the seasonally adjusted number of new dwellings rose 3%. Canterbury consented 30% of the country's new dwellings, while Auckland consented 26%. The trend for the number of new dwellings, including apartments, is at its highest level since October 2007, but is still 29% below the series maximum in January 2004. Westpac's senior economist Michael Gordon says growth is driven by the regions where concerns about the supply of housing have pushed up house prices in recent years.
The trend has been we've seen very strong growth in consents in the Canterbury region. Obviously, that's reflecting the rebuild getting underway. We're also seeing a general upward trend in consents in Auckland, although that has been patchy at times, but there were some fairly strong numbers for February. That's necessary because it is, one of the regions of the country where there does seem to be the most significant shortage of housing. And as a result, we've seen prices rising faster in Auckland than in the rest of the country. So I think what we're seeing now is we're starting to see the market mechanisms at work, albeit very slowly. So there's been a shortage of houses, prices have gone up. That's improved margins for builders, and now we're starting to see a response from the building industry.
Westpac senior economist Michael Gordon. The International Monetary Fund says the country's decision makers are taking the right steps to ensure Auckland's heated housing market does not pose a threat to growth. In its annual stock take, the Washington-based organisation says the economy's prospects have improved due to the rebuilding of Christchurch and high global commodity prices, with growth tipped to be about 3.5% this year. While house price growth has eased slightly recently, the IMF says it could still damage the financial system if there's an economic shock. The head of the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department, Brian Aitken, says a combination of higher interest rates, lending restrictions and making more land available should help.
Interest rate increases, so monetary policy should help cool demand in the housing market. The second one is the LVR restrictions. Again, those may have had an effect on cooling the market. It's a little bit early to make a judgment on that. And then the third one is the steps that the government has recently taken with Auckland to fast-track land supply. And the supply side is really the most important thing from the longer run point of view to cool the market and increase in affordability.
Brian Aitken also says a sharp slowdown in China could hurt the economy, though he doesn't believe that's imminent. He also says the dollar is overvalued by between 5 and 15%, reiterated concern about the country's persistent current account deficits, and noted the retail banks are vulnerable due to their reliance on overseas funding. The IMF endorsed the government's debt reduction plan to ensure the country's in good shape to withstand any nasty shocks in the future. Online sales are expected to continue to grow strongly, and more of our money could be going to overseas merchants. The Bank of New Zealand's online retail sales index for domestic purchases for the 3 months to February grew 10% compared with the same period last year, while online purchases from overseas merchants grew 24% on a 3-monthly basis. Growth rates across the categories were mixed. Furniture, groceries and pharmaceuticals experienced strong domestic growth, while international retailers had double-digit growth across most major categories, including clothing and footwear and books. The BNZ's Director of Research, Gary Baker, says offshore online retailers are powering ahead.
If the momentum carries on as it is now, international are going to continue to gain share. I think New Zealand is still behind some of the other Western countries in terms of online purchases versus purchases in physical stores. So the whole category of online sales would expect to continue to grow quite strongly. It's hard to pick what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years with exchange rates and all sorts of things, but certainly the trend at the moment is for international to continue to gain market share.
And so do you think consumers have got a lot more comfortable about putting their details online and purchasing online from overseas?
Yes, definitely. I think that's the case, and also they've probably got more comfort around delivery as well and timing.
And do you see the mix staying the same, the apparel and the entertainment coming more from offshore?
Yes, and the trend at the moment is in those categories, offshore is generally growing faster, so it's continuing to gain more and more shares. It is a bit of a mixture, though. Yes, some categories do move around. Some categories lend themselves naturally to more purchases locally, like your fresh groceries, for example. You'd expect those to stay predominantly local. And things like furniture, perhaps, maybe like that as well, because the big bulky items probably not as efficient to ship in individual units.
The BNZ's Director of Research, Gary Baker. Looking at the markets, and US stocks have risen, led by technology and financial shares after comments from Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen. Ms. Yellen said the US Central Bank's extraordinary commitment to boosting the economy, especially the still struggling labour market, will be needed for some time to come. She hinted that interest rates would remain at near zero levels for an extended period. The Dow Jones Index is up about 138 points, or 0.8%, at 16,462. The Nasdaq Composite up 51 points, or 1.2%, to 4,207. The S&P 500 Index up 16 points, or 0.8%, at 1,873. Across the Tasman, the Australian 200 index closed yesterday up 28 points to 5,395. The NZX 50 slipped 3 points to 5,140. The New Zealand dollar is at 86.68 US cents, 93.54 Australian, 51.97 pence, 89.33 yen, 0.6293 euro and 5.39 renminbi. Brent crude oil is trading at $106 a barrel, and gold is trading at $1,285 an ounce. That's business for now. I'll be back with more on the markets at 8:30. But for now, it's coming up to 7 o'clock.
The Kokako. Radio New Zealand National.
No mai haere mai ki Morning Report. It's Tuesday, April the 1st, and that, believe it or not, was the first theme tune we ever had on Morning Report back in 1975. I'm Geoff Robinson. Simon Mercett's with me in the Wellington studio today, and on the programme this morning, the United Nations highest court orders Japan to stop whaling in the Antarctic.
And as many of you know, this is Geoff's final day on Morning Report and at Radio New Zealand. This morning, we'll be bringing you highlights of Geoff's 44-year broadcasting career. Here's a taste of just some of the tens of thousands of stories Geoff's covered.
There have been unprecedented attacks with 4 planes hijacked and 3 of them deliberately crashed into New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Loss of story today on the programme, the aftermath of the earthquake in Christchurch. 2 explosions rocked the ship and she sank at her berth at Marsden Wharf. People in Aramoana near Dunedin are waking this morning to a tragedy which hit the tiny township last night, leaving at least 2 dead, several missing, feared dead. It's 8 now, and with us in the studio is the Prime Minister, David Lange. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
No turning back now?
No.
Do you feel better for it?
Yes.
We'll have more throughout the programme, and today we will be bringing you some highlights of Geoff's career at Radio New Zealand. He's been the voice of Morning Report since 1976, and today he retires. We'll be looking back at many of the major news stories he's covered over the past 4 decades in his broadcasting career. But we are also going to look at the news of the day.
Indeed, in a landmark decision, Japan has been told it must stop all whaling in the Antarctic. The decision was made in the International Court of Justice after Australia brought the legal challenge against Japan. It was the first time any country had used an international court to try to stop whaling. The court, which sits in The Hague, has ruled Japan should stop its whaling program with immediate effect and cease granting new permits for the killing, taking and treating of whales. The court president, Peter Tomka, said the scientific output of the program, known as JAPA 2, appears limited.
Taken as a whole, the court considers that JAPA 2 involves activities that can broadly be characterized as scientific research, but that the evidence does not establish that the program's design and implementation are reasonable in relation to achieving its stated objectives.
The spokesperson for Japan's delegation in The Hague, Nori Shikota, says they're disappointed by the court's decision but will abide by the ruling.
During the days and weeks to come back in Japan, we will consider our future course of action. But one thing which is clear is that we are saying that we are going to abide by the decision of the court.
Phil Peterson is the bosun on board the Bob Barker ship, which is owned by the Sea Shepherd organisation and is currently docked in Wellington.
We were related. Actually, I was watching it live, and at one point I just was sitting there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I didn't really think that it was going to go that way, but it was pretty overwhelming to see the vote 12-4 on the 7 points, and what was there, 13-3 on one of the other points. It was quite impressive to see that justice has been served, and it's a big win for the whales, obviously.
Well, we'll go to The Hague now. The BBC's Anna Holligan was in the International Court of Justice, and she's with us now. Anna, just take us through. This sounds like a very comprehensive decision from the court.
Absolutely, and you're right to call it a landmark case. And it took the judges here in The Hague an hour and a half to read through this judgment. It was so substantial and it was groundbreaking because it's the first time this court has been asked to make a ruling on a case like this. And as you heard there from the activists, they've described this as a kind of make or break test case for whaling. So basically, the Japanese had argued that they were involved in a program of scientific research, this JARPA 2 program. The Australians, with New Zealand intervening, had accused Japan of using science as a kind of disguise for what was actually commercial whaling. So because they wanted to use the whale meat for dinners in Tokyo, it's less popular than it used to be, but it's still served there, and many feel it's part of the Japanese tradition. Now, the judgment took a while to get to, But essentially, to break it down to its most crucial elements, it came down to this. The judges ruled that because since 2005, 3,600 minke whales have been killed, and only a limited amount of scientific research has come from that, so it couldn't be proved, as far as the judges were concerned, that this was indeed scientific research.
Now, this is a 70-page finding, lots of fine print. Is there any room there for the Japanese to get out of it in any way at all?
Very good question. And you heard there actually from Nori Shikata, who was representing the Japanese delegation here. And he was actually here with me earlier. And I asked him this question maybe 5 or 6 times. And it was very difficult to get an answer as to whether this was the end of whaling altogether in the Southern Ocean. He was basically saying, we need to look at this judgment. We need to work out what the limitations are. He made it very clear that Japan is prepared to act within the international law, to stick to the International Whaling Convention. But they want to look at the small print, and they want to work out whether there is another way of continuing with the practice, but within the realms of scientific research. So they don't want to break the rules, but they want to see if they can find a way to work within them to keep Tokyo happy and also the rest of the world, although the activists will still be keeping an eye on things down there.
Anna, thank you very much for that. That's the BBC's Anna Holligan at The Hague. It's 7:15. Well, listening to all this has been the Foreign Affairs Minister, Murray McCully. Good morning, Mr McCully.
Good morning.
So what do you make of it? Is it a landmark, absolutely 100% decision that everyone would have wanted in terms of protecting the whales in the Southern Ocean?
Yes, it is. It's absolutely the outer edge of what I think any of us dared hope for. Of course, you need to remind yourself that this is a court case that many people were very apprehensive about because eminent lawyers like Sir Geoffrey Palmer have argued that you could end up in taking such a case simply confirming Japan's right to whale under these circumstances. Now, this judgment, as you've had described to you, is very firm and very clear, but it still does leave Japan with a decision to make after they've digested this, which is to look at whether they try and devise a new program that is scientifically based, that they could embark upon whaling in the Southern Ocean again. And our task is to make sure that we carry out a diplomatic conversation that dissuades them from embarking on that course.
So that door is still open?
Yeah, it's the specific program that they've got in operation at the moment called JAPA 2 that the court has ruled is outside the IWC rules, and it's told them that they've got to stop whaling under that program. They could still try and put together a new program that tried to meet some of the tests that the court's outlined. We hope that won't happen, and in the short term I'm sure it won't, because this is going to take a bit of working through.
And of course Japan also conducts other whaling in the northern Pacific. I mean, could they redirect resources there?
Well, they could, but of course that's going to be an interesting question now, faced with the decision the court's made in The Hague overnight. It's quite likely that someone's going to look at the other whaling programs that Japan's embarked upon on the so-called scientific heading and try and enforce the same judgment in relation to those programs.
Is this really Australia's victory, not New Zealand's?
Oh, look, I think New Zealand can take significant credit from this. The legal case that New Zealand spelt out as intervener in the court is essentially the logic that the court's outlined in its judgment last night. So I think the lawyers who serve the New Zealand government's interests here have absolutely picked the right lines to run with the court, and have effectively had their position confirmed. I think that there's a big victory for the Australian case here, and we should. I sent Julie Bishop a text message last night to congratulate her and the government on achieving it. But that doesn't mean this thing's over yet. Japan has been involved in this practice for some time. We hope that we can avoid an outcome which sees them look at whaling in the Southern Oceans under a different program, and that's where the diplomacy is going to be important over the coming weeks.
Would you say that the Sea Shepherd organisation is due a vote of thanks at all?
No, I wouldn't. In many ways, I've said before that this is a program that is carried out today largely for reasons of pride on Japan's part rather than because they've got a use for the whale meat or any useful scientific outcomes. And one of the problems has been that the protest activity down there has rather made Japan dig its heels in. So while I'm sure that some of the Sea Shepherd people will claim credit for it, in fact, my own perspective has been that Japan needs a bit of space here to work its way out of what is a practice that's got no future.
The Foreign Affairs Minister, Murray McCully, thank you. 7:19.
A local kaumātua will bless the site this morning on Auckland's Totara Vale Reserve, where the remains of Auckland woman Sissy Chen were discovered last week. Mrs. Chen, a 44-year-old accountant, went missing from her home on Guy Fawkes Night in 2012. Her remains were found in a drain at the Auckland Reserve, and police have since found other parts of her skeleton in the area. The officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Inspector Bruce Scott, joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning, Geoff.
Anything happened overnight? Any developments?
Nothing much overnight, but we're certainly pleased that Sissy has been identified and will be able to return her remains to her family in China.
At this point, are you able to talk about the cause of death?
No, I can't talk about the cause of death at the moment, Geoff. That's operationally we need to keep that to ourselves just at the moment.
Do you have any particular fresh leads at the moment?
We've got a number of inquiries that we're making. We've got people to talk to, people that we've previously talked to. Now that we've discovered where Sissy's body was placed, we need to re-interview some people and get more information.
Was placed. You're confident that she was dead when her body was placed in the drain?
Yes, we are confident that she was placed there.
You're re-interviewing people from the earlier investigation, you said?
Yes, we are. Yep.
Is her partner still in the country?
Yes, he is.
What's been his reaction?
He's keen to see the inquiry completed.
Is he a suspect?
I can't talk about who may or may not be suspects, Geoff, unfortunately.
Can you tell me whether it was an area where Sissy Chen, would she have known the area? Would she have walked around there?
She and her partner both knew the area because they had lived nearby and had walked in that vicinity. We understand now from friends.
So is this an area that you were previously searching, you suspected she might be?
No, we hadn't searched this area. We searched a lot of ponds and areas on the North Shore using a police dive squad and other specialist teams. But this, with the information that we had at the time, this wasn't one of those places that we searched.
Now, is there any way the public can help you in this investigation?
Well, we're doing an area canvass around the Totara Vale Reserve, and we're hoping that anybody that may have seen anything suspicious, especially on the 5th of November 2012, will be able to come forward and talk to us.
Indeed, let's hope they can. Thank you for joining us this morning, Detective Inspector Bruce Scott. 7:21.
And top stories this morning. Anti-whaling groups are elated after a court rules Japan must stop whaling in the Antarctic.
Police search for more clues about the death of Sissy Chen.
Councils want the government to help them prepare for climate change.
And former students consider bankruptcy to avoid paying off their loans.
Bankruptcy won't mean much for you if you're living in Australia or the UK. It is quite a viable option for someone who doesn't ever see themselves returning.
Our education correspondent takes a closer look at the new loan rules, and that'll be before 8 o'clock. 7:22.
Now, this morning we are bringing you some highlights of Geoff's career at Radio New Zealand. He's been the voice of Morning Report since 1976. He's been at the helm of Morning Report for many of the major news stories over the past 4 decades. And, for example, for many listeners, the first they knew of the 9/11 attacks in the United States in 2001 was when they turned on Morning Report. We abandoned all the usual programming and went to air from 5 a.m. Here's how Geoff brought the news of the attacks to listeners.
The worst terrorist attacks on the United States mainland in modern history have struck at the heart of New York and Washington and plunged the country into chaos and panic. The United States. There have been unprecedented attacks with 4 planes hijacked and 3 of them deliberately crashed into New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Loss of life is expected to be catastrophic from the subsequent collapse of the two towers of the centre where many thousands of people work. There are believed to be casualties at the Pentagon as well, the headquarters of the American military, where the building is on fire. All major government buildings...
Massive rescue effort that's going on right now. We're trying to evacuate thousands and thousands of people. We have as many of our police and fire personnel as we have.
Well, our reporter Ray Lamb was in New York.
We'll leave the CNN coverage for a moment there because our health correspondent Ray Lamb is in the United States on a scholarship at the moment, and Ray joins us now. Ray, I understand you're on the streets of Manhattan.
I am, Geoff. I was sitting at a meeting when just after 9 the word came through that the World Trade Center, one of the buildings had been hit by a plane. The meeting broke up, and obviously we hit the TV set. I'm now outside. I've headed downtown, and it's just the most amazing scenes. It's just, they're talking about it being the day America stood still, and that's what it feels like.
And we crossed back and forth to the international coverage all morning, and we went to another New Zealand voice, our ambassador to the United Nations, Don Mackay. Are you able to say that all the New Zealanders who, for instance, work with you at the United Nations are safe at this point?
Yes, good morning, Geoff. Yes, all of the New Zealanders who work in the mission, and indeed those who work at the New Zealand consulate and their families are safe. But at this stage, we're not able to go much further than that.
So, Geoff, of all the major events you've covered, and there have been many, that must have been a particularly extraordinary morning.
It certainly was. I mean, the horror of it just sort of came through to us as the morning went on. You do get caught up in the excitement of coverage of something like that, as you know, and the adrenaline rush sort of pushes you along to do things and get more information there. But at the same time, you started to realise just what this meant, and we took it in, we being Sean, who was working with me then, took it in turns to be in the studio, as it were, hosting it, and then in the other studio recording people to bring them back and play them into the programme, describing what was going on. And then Kim came and joined us after just about 8:30, I think, and we rotated again. And that was really the first moment that we had to stop and just pause. You walked out of the studio and thought, blimey, what have I been involved in? And you do come down quite hard. And it was exciting, it was horrible, and probably the most important story I'll ever be involved with.
And there has been, on the local scene in more recent times, another horrible story that you and I have both covered. That was when the devastating 6.3 magnitude quake hit Christchurch. And, of course, people then did turn to Radio New Zealand for news.
Today's, I guess, a kind of a warning message for those Kiwis that are living in Libya to kind of avoid these more dangerous areas, and calling for the regime to show constraint. Oh, there's a big earthquake. Oh, shit.
Are you still there? Are you still there? Are you still there? I lost you. Are you still there? I lost you. I've lost you.
Shit.
I've lost you.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to go. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
That was our reporter Bridget Mills reporting conducting an interview as the earthquake struck in Christchurch. The morning after the quake, when survivors were still being found, Geoff introduced our coverage like this.
And there's only one story today on the programme, the aftermath of the earthquake in Christchurch. We'll be talking to the rescue authorities, to the Prime Minister, the police and the people of a city which is still, of course, trying to recover from the earlier earthquake last September. It's a scene of devastation down there. We'll bring the information about rescues and the death toll, sadly, as the programme continues.
One of the key interviews that morning was with the police commander who'd been working all night to rescue people.
Superintendent Russell Gibson was the police night shift commander in Christchurch last night. This is what he told us an hour ago.
There is incredible carnage right throughout the CBD. It's completely cordoned off with the army and police staff. We're currently virtually going door to door through those buildings, crying out to see if we can hear people who are trapped in those buildings. But most of our attention has been on two buildings, which is the Canterbury TV building and also the PGG building in Cambridge Terrace.
You've got 3 people out of the Canterbury TV building, I understand, and 8 out of the other one?
No, we've got significantly more out of both of them, to be honest. We've been pulling 20 or 30 people out of those buildings right throughout the night.
And when I was in Christchurch, I was taken into the red zone to the site of the collapsed CTV building, and it was a very sobering experience. And this is the CTV building that we're coming up to, and this is as close as we're going to get to it. There are a barrier across the road, and we're stopping here, and you can see the rescue workers, the Caterpillar excavators on the building. They're wearing, some of them are in light blue, maybe the Japanese crew we've been hearing about, and others I can see the yellow and orange jackets. They seem to be about, 3 metres above ground level where they are at the moment. Some of them in masks, and there's one very big crane here. I imagine they swing that over and load what they can on a bit at a time and then swing it away.
And Geoff was back in Christchurch for the memorial service for the people who died in the quake. Now, Geoff's anchored many state funerals and memorials. This was one of the tougher ones.
A few moments ago, we saw the sight of the urban rescue teams, all in their highly coloured dungarees and their fluorescent vests marching in. And as they marched in, the crowd stood and cheered. I mean, it was a very emotional moment for all the people here. It certainly was. You can hear it in my voice, can't you?
Certainly can, indeed. Well, we were both covering the Christchurch and both went down and did trips there to do outside broadcasts from the city over a period of many months and, in fact, years. This has been an event which has just carried on for all that time, Geoff. It still resonates today.
Well, indeed, as you remember, our broadcasting position was in front of the Christchurch Arts Centre, underneath all that glass, building there. And I remember, indeed, sitting there talking to Jerry Brownlee one morning as a quake came, and we could hear this sort of rattling of the glass behind us and the doors, but the building was designed to be earthquake-proof, and it worked while we were there, thank goodness. But one of the things I've always found most difficult was that with a disaster like that, you have to do those awful how do you feel stories. You have to interview the survivors and get them to tell you what it's like, and it's gut-wrenching, isn't it?
It is. It takes something out of you, but as you say, it's your job. Got to do it. It's 7:30 on Morning Report, and still to come before 8 o'clock. An international report says we are unprepared for the increased floods, droughts and wildfires expected as a result of climate change. As the fruitless search for the missing Malaysian plane continues, authorities in Kuala Lumpur issue a new version of the last communication with the aircraft. And believe it or not, we'll have Geoff on a roller coaster. Just some traffic news. Thankfully, no incidents to report, but on the motorways in Auckland, the northern is slow between Greville and Onewa. The southern also slow between Drury and Takanini, heavy going between Manukau and Market Road. The northwestern heavy between Westgate and Lincoln Road, and the southwestern moderate to heavy between Lambie Drive and Massey Road. 25 to 8.
An international report says we're unprepared for the increase in floods, droughts and wildfires expected as a result of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found New Zealand has a significant adaptation deficit, and that any work done to prepare have been conceptual and not about implementation. The President of Local Government New Zealand, Lawrence Yule, says the central government must do more to help councils prepare.
Effectively, we bury our heads in the sand. We are doing nothing to best position our communities for where we're going to end up in 100 years. And I don't think it is acceptable that local government just gets left to sort of, peddle this itself.
But the Climate Change Minister, Tim Grosser, says local problems need local solutions.
Conditions vary enormously around our country, and we think we should give people the tools to address this, the right information, but finally it is better left to the people in the community to decide what specifically they need to do rather than trying to impose a one-size-fits-all approach from the central government.
Well, the Adjunct Research Associate at Victoria University's Climate Change Research Institute, Judy Lawrence, agrees we're not well prepared for the effects of climate change, and she's with us now. Ms. Lawrence, how much is that because local government is overwhelmed by the size of the problems that are there in front of them?
Oh, good morning, Geoff. I think that, yes, they are overwhelmed because some things are better done at a national level, some things are better done at regional and others at the local level. And this is a all-hands-to-the-pump issue because we have to move from reacting to one-off disasters and plan for ongoing change that will become more frequent. And so this is something we haven't had to deal with before.
So does central government need to be coordinating what the individual local governments are doing?
I think central government needs to work closely with local government and coordinate some things it's best able to do, and not to direct it, but to work with it and to work with the communities that are affected.
Do you think we actually, deep down, accept that there is going to be significant change to the environment because of climate change?
Yes, I think we do. And in all the discussions we have with local communities and the local authorities, is that, yes, there is a problem. They know there's a problem, but it is very difficult. It's difficult when individuals are affected by these things in the short term, but these are long-term issues. So we need to rise above the short-term interests and look at ways in which we can stage our change over time and take into account the interests of people through time, not just this generation.
It's easy in one sense to say that, but when there's a hazard line going through your property where you've lived for the last 30 years and your parents did before you, it's a bit different, isn't it?
Well, Geoff, I once drew a hazard line through my place in the 70s when we had landslips around this part of Wellington, and this is the way to go. It is a hazard line in itself is not the issue. Is that the best way to actually identify the risk, or is it better for us to sit down and find out ways in which we can identify the hazard, look at who's vulnerable, what is at risk nationally, where are the most important things that we need to do? We make decisions today that will last a very long time, and we're not integrating climate change considerations into them. We have some interesting innovations occurring around New Zealand. Local government is starting to do stuff. They are working together and sharing information, and it's this sort of sharing that I think we need to use as a bit of a platform to draw central government in and to look at ways in which central government can contribute in a more collegial way, if you like, rather than just saying leave it to local government.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us with that. Judy Lawrence, Adjunct Research Associate of Victoria University's Climate Change Research Institute. 21 to 8. As the fruitless search for the missing Malaysian plane continues, authorities in Kuala Lumpur have issued a new version of the last communication with the aircraft. The last words spoken are now said to have been "Good night, Malaysian 370," and not "All right, good night," as originally reported. The Transport Ministry says forensic investigations will determine whether the pilot or co-pilot spoke the words, which came at 1:19 a.m. Malaysian time on the morning of March the 8th. CNN's Paula Hancock was at the media conference when the change was announced and says the new version is more formal and more in keeping with the way a pilot might usually speak to air traffic control. But once again, it raises questions about Malaysia's handling of the case.
The more significant point is that the Ministry of Transport has had to come out with this transcript, and it seems as though it's another turnaround for Malaysian authorities. The fact that it took well over 3 weeks to come out with the exact transcript. This information this evening will just add to the criticism about the way in the direction this investigation is going.
And as the families of the passengers and crew continue their anguished wait, a judge in Chicago has dismissed early legal action taken against Malaysia Airlines. That's been welcomed by James Healy-Pratt, head of aviation law at Stewart's Law in London, who says the move was never going to succeed.
The prospect of success of lawsuits in America is very, very slim. And literally an hour ago, I saw the lawsuit there was lots of noise made in the media about, dismissed by the Chicago court as being improper. And the lawyers that brought it were warned very seriously by the judge if they tried this again that there would be sanctions. So that lawsuit, and it wasn't even a lawsuit, it was a discovery petition, was gone. And that's good, because that was an unnecessary distraction for the families. And any lawyer who was suggesting that families could go to the American courts and claim millions in compensation were frankly misleading the families, and they were raising their expectations, because that simply is not a realistic option for the families of MH370.
Does it matter if the plane is never found?
It doesn't matter if the plane is never found, because under international law, an international treaty called the Montreal Convention applies to the legal relationship between the passengers and their families and Malaysia Airlines. And what that international treaty does is it makes Malaysian Airlines liable to pay full compensatory damages. And so the only issue for the families on the compensation issue is the best jurisdiction for the family to bring the claim against Malaysian Airlines.
Are there similarities between this case and the Air France case? I think you were involved in that, weren't you?
Yes, in Air France 447, which was some 4.5 years ago, 228 people lost their lives over the South Atlantic, and we helped many families there. In the first week after the disappearance of MH370, it did feel, in my recollection, that it could have been a similar Air France type event, a disappearance of a large passenger jet at altitude with no real explanation. But of course, in MH370, we've heard all sorts of other theories of a far more sinister nature. But coming back to the international law perspective, the rights that the families have against the airline are pretty similar to those that they had in Air France 447. And again, in Air France 447, there was some litigation in America, and the judge in California in federal court decided it wasn't the right place, or let alone the right country. So those cases are dismissed, and the vast majority of cases settled outside the United States.
And in terms of any possible action against the manufacturer of the aircraft, that presumably is really dependent upon some wreckage being found.
Well, you're absolutely right there. Until the black boxes are located, recovered and analysed, we won't know what happened on board MH370. We might never know, for example, if the black boxes have been manually turned off, and that has happened in a notorious accident called Silkair 185, which was in Indonesia in 1997. But any action against any manufacturer would need some form of evidence. And, of course, that's going to come from the black boxes.
That's James Healy-Pratt, Head of Aviation Law at Stewart's Law in London. 16 to 8.
Let's have a look at the headlines in the newspapers this morning. The New Zealand Herald leads with the headline, Breakthrough in Cold Case Killing. The paper says bones discovered in a drain on Auckland's North Shore have been confirmed as those of missing accountant Sissy Chen. The paper says the 44-year-old went missing 16 months ago.
The Waikato Times features a large photograph of Christchurch woman Amy Farrell, who was found dead in the boot of her car. The paper says the man at the centre of the inquiry into her death and an attack on 2 hitchhikers had been out of prison for 6 months and was still on parole.
On the same story, the Dominion Post leads with the headline, Parole Inquiry After Attacks. The paper says Corrections is looking at its supervision of the man at the centre of the police investigation into the death of Amy Farrell.
The press has a photograph of police forensic experts involved in the investigation of Amy Farrell's death, searching for clues at a Wildberry Road property in Woolston.
And the Otago Daily Times reports on how a prime Queenstown waterfront site, once occupied by stables, could be used for a $6 million 3-storey retail development. Some of what's in your papers this morning. It's 7:45. Gary Ahern is here with what looked like could have been great cricket news and rapidly went in the wrong direction once New Zealand started to bat.
Somewhat humiliating it was, Simon, needing a modest 120 to beat Sri Lanka and go through to the semi-finals of the 2020 World Cup in Bangladesh. The Black Caps were dismissed for their lowest T20 total, just 60, 42 of which were scored by Kane Williamson. The New Zealand bowling coach Shane Bond says it was a dreary dressing room after such a lame loss.
It would have been pretty good if it was flat. It was dire, to be fair. I think range of emotions: upset, angry, disappointed. We came here to win the tournament and believed that we had a lineup that could do so. And as a group, we feel like we've let ourselves down, and certainly the public down in the way that we've performed. And both we as a team and probably the public have every right to be disappointed with what we put out there today.
But in the result of the day, maybe of the tournament, outsiders the Netherlands beat England by 45 runs. And in the women's tournament, the White Ferns' last over loss to South Africa meant they missed out on their semi-finals. South Africa and Australia going through with superior run rates. The rugby league world is in shock following confirmation that the young Newcastle Knights forward Alex McKinnon is facing life in a wheelchair after being diagnosed as a quadriplegic. The 22-year-old sustained his injuries on Monday last week when he landed on his neck in a tackle by 3 Melbourne Storm players, one of whom, Jordan McLean, will appear before the NRL judiciary tomorrow in what's certain to be a difficult situation for all involved. The former Australian international Matthew John says McKinnon's diagnosis has sent shockwaves through the game.
Everyone in sport, not just rugby league, they're in total shock. Spoken to a couple of my friends up there at Newcastle, they can't believe it. There was always the chance there was going to be this type of terrible news, but everyone was sort of praying that it wouldn't be. Now the young boy who's so universally liked and respected in rugby league, he may not walk again.
Matthew Johns. The Australian golfer Stephen Bowditch has been hailed as a true champion after battling through the depths of depression and posting his first win on the US PGA Tour. The 30-year-old Queenslander won the Texas Open yesterday, earning, among a number of huge bonuses, a start in next week's US Masters at Augusta, Georgia. In other headlines, the New Zealand women's hockey team came from behind to beat China 3-2 in the first match of their two-test series last night in Taupo. Game 2 starts at 6 o'clock tonight. And the New Zealand netball teams, the Mainland Tactics and Central Pulse, were both well beaten last night by their Australian opponents, the Melbourne Vixens and New South Wales Swifts. That's sport.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's 12 to 8 now. Top stories this morning. Disappointment from Japan as it's ordered to stop whaling in the Antarctic.
Witnesses are re-interviewed by police after bones found in a drain were confirmed to be Sissy Chen's.
Malaysian authorities issue a new version of the last communication with the missing plane.
And New Zealand's underprepared for the effects of climate change.
It's one of the most significant issues that is faced by New Zealand, particularly in coastal communities, and we're never going to solve it by local government alone.
Our science reporter looks at what needs to be done after 8. 12 minutes away.
Well, more now on the thousands and thousands of stories Geoff has covered over his career here on Morning Report. Often, as we've been discussing this morning, it's not even. The stories can be grim. They can involve the loss of life. When the French bombed the Rainbow Warrior late one July evening in 1985, here's how Geoff reported it the next day.
2 explosions rocked the ship and she sank at her berth at Marsden Wharf. A member of the crew was missing after the sinking and his body was found by police divers late this morning. The Rainbow Warrior was due to sail in a few days for Mururoa on a Greenpeace mission in a flotilla of anti-nuclear protest ships. But to get the story on here, we had to speak to a Greenpeace spokesperson in Washington. Here's what Stephen McAllister told me back then.
We spoke with the captain of the boat from Auckland, and as far as he could figure, there was no reason for this explosion to have occurred naturally, shall we say. There's no explosives kept down there in the engine room. It's a diesel ship. So we, at this point, we're kind of rule out that it was anything, shall I say, natural on board.
Well, Geoff, that story was very much in our backyard, but the initial news gathering was pretty tricky, wasn't it?
Well, it certainly was. I think Peter Kingston picked the story up, first of all, in the evening and reported it, but then there became a security clampdown by the police in Auckland around the docks. We just couldn't get anyone to talk. We couldn't ring and talk to anyone in Auckland, so we ended up ringing Greenpeace in Washington to get the information, which was the only way we could find out what they'd heard from the crew of the Rainbow Warrior. And that, of course, was the only way we got the information to the listeners.
Right, let's hear now from some other stories which will remain long in our memory. This from November 1979.
Wreckage has been sighted in the Antarctica on a location which indicates Mount Erebus.
And this news from November 1990.
People in Aramoana near Dunedin are waking this morning to a tragedy which hit the tiny township last night, leaving at least 2 dead, several missing, feared dead, and 3 injured.
Well, politics has always been a big part of Morning Report, of course. During his time at Radio New Zealand, Geoff has anchored election night coverage in 1981, 84, 87 and 90. The election of 1984 was particularly memorable. That then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon had taken a gamble to call a snap election.
You can't govern unless you're certain. At the moment, we can't be certain.
That was some election night, right, Geoff?
It certainly was. All those elections were first past the post, so we always had a winner on the night. And one thing I remember from that is that we were doing an interview actually with Robert Muldoon at the time, and everyone around the table was listening to it. And then, because our microphones were live, there was a kind of stage whisper that I heard from Nigel Roberts, the political scientist who was with us. He's conceded. And really, it was only at that point that the realisation came through to us. Yes, he was. He'd been beaten by David Lange.
Now, Robert Muldoon was at times abrasive politician, often with journalists. What sort of time did you have talking to him?
It's a challenging interview subject. The advantage I thought I always had was that we always talked with him on the phone. He never came into the studio, so we didn't have that malevolent presence Sorry, but that's what he was, looking at us. So one was able to ignore the overtone and just concentrate on the topic on hand.
All right. And, of course, speaking of Prime Ministers, when a sitting Prime Minister resigns, that is a big story. And when David Lange did just that in August 1989, both Geoff Robinson and his co-presenter then, Maggie Barry, wanted to do the interview. Well, as still happens to this day, Geoff,
Indeed.
Sometimes when we can't agree or it's not obvious, we'll toss a coin. And in that case, I think you probably both wanted to do the interview. And in that morning, back in 1989, Geoff won.
It's 20 minutes to 8 now, and with us in the studio is the Prime Minister, David Lange. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
No turning back now?
No.
Do you feel better for it?
Yes.
In what way?
I just feel... I feel glad that I've demonstrated that the government is capable of winning the next election. I am glad, despite the fact that I never commented on specific polls, that at last we had a couple of polls that showed us, and we had the enormous turnaround from 23% behind in June in the Insight poll to 6 behind in exactly the same methodology. And when I got that one, I knew the moment had come.
You waited for that poll to come?
I sure have.
It was an intriguing morning because it was the lead story. It was going to be, it should have been there at 7, but he refused to come in at 7. He only said after a lot of argument, well, I'll come in at 20 to 8 after I've had my swim. Because there was a pool in the Beehive and Broadcasting House, of course, to the back of the Beehive then. So he came in, hair wet. He had this tin of Diet Coke that he was hanging on to, and he just wouldn't engage with us. I mean, normally he would come in and sit and talk to us quite happily before the interview started.
But not that time.
Not that time. He just sat there. And I was thinking, how on earth am I going to... get through to him? How am I going to break through?
Make him open up.
What's my first question going to be? And I really don't know where those words came from. They just sort of popped into my head, and he looked at me, and then he responded, and he gave. I mean, he was too much of a ham in that sense. He knew there was an audience there. He told his story. It went away. And it was a good interview in the end. But,
it was indeed.
It was a worry.
Should remind you, it's 6 minutes to 8 here on Morning Report for the last time with Geoff Robinson and me, Simon Mersep. Now then there is business, and when stock markets crashed all around the world, Geoff reported about the falls on the morning of what became Black Tuesday.
Share prices in markets around the world plunged disastrously yesterday and overnight in the wake of big falls on Wall Street last week. Here in New Zealand, the Barclays Index recorded a fall of nearly 155 points, closing at 3,430.
Now, Geoff, as we know, getting interviews to air can be a challenge. It's not always straightforward, is it?
Indeed it wasn't. Now, that morning we wanted to talk to Bob Jones because his value had dropped dramatically with this news, if you like. And he agreed to come in and talk about it. But he said, I need a car park. Well, we couldn't find a car park for him. So our then producer, Jonathan Swass, who I think has just been appointed our ambassador in Timor-Leste, but that's another story. He went out and stood on the pavement, and Bob Jones drove up, hopped out of his Jaguar. Jonathan hopped in and drove off. Bob Jones came in to do the interview. And indeed, as someone who'd lost that much money, he was quite remarkably chipper.
Was he? You still remember that?
He'd lost more than $70 million in value. At least that's what I thought he had.
Well, as a matter of fact, I've got 186 million shares, so I guess in the last week or so, it's really amounts to a great deal more than that, about 400 million. But you see, I don't view it that way, and I think you'll find that most people don't view it that way because nothing's in fact changed.
Well, that was Bob
That's
Jones.
what he says.
Jonathan drove round the block until listening to the interview on the car radio, and when it was over, he drove back up the door and they swapped over and life went on.
And you've spoken to Bob Jones many times over the years, I'm sure.
Indeed I have.
An engaging chap to talk to?
At times. It depends on his mood.
Now, it's 4 minutes to 8. Now, Geoff and I are here to present Morning Report to you for the last time as presenters, but of course this program will carry on with new presenters, 2 of them in fact, and they're both with us in the Wellington studio now. So welcome to Susie Ferguson and to Guy Nestman. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You.
And you will be taking over from Geoff and I tomorrow morning, and it's not just Guy and Susie, there's some changes to the way the program's presented?
Please tell me you're going to change what I think is the worst theme tune the second worst theme tune we've ever had.
We can promise that the theme music will change. It should be the first difference that people will notice. They won't notice. We're certainly not throwing out the baby with the bathwater at all. So all those key elements of the morning report will continue, but people will notice change, and the first thing that they'll notice will be the new theme music, and then the dulcet tones of Susie and myself.
Yeah, two new presenters, and we're certainly wanting to very much keep the integrity of Morning Report, keep it as the agenda-setting programme in New Zealand. Freshen it up here and there, change it around here and there.
Everything is change, embrace change.
Absolutely.
We'll go for it.
The bird remains, though.
Thank goodness.
We couldn't get rid of the bird.
And something else which remains, which we should remember, because for many years Nicola Wright has been presenting the news for us on Morning Report, and I think she will continue to do that, which is good news, for some time, hopefully, to come.
Absolutely.
And, Diane, another thing is, as we have in the last few years when I've been doing it, I've been in Auckland, Geoff's been in Wellington. That will continue, that Auckland-Wellington split, if you like.
That will continue. Initially, for the first few shows, I'll be presenting with Susie down in Wellington here, and then I'll be moving back to Auckland and be co-hosting from Auckland. I think that that split has worked well, and we're doing what we can to engage listeners in Auckland as well as the rest of the country, so I think that's an important
and Susie, I hope you're going to continue the tradition of tossing when need be. You toss when you both want to do an interview, and you toss when you both don't want to do an interview. And there are mornings when those do happen.
It's happened a few times lately.
Well, we haven't quite worked out how we're going to do that, so it'll be one that we come across, and we'll have to figure out how we're going to do it.
And you have to trust each other implicitly about the result.
Oh, is that the key? Is it? That's not what Geoff was telling me.
Now, we should mention, just in case Susie and Guy think that all the interviews are serious and the tone is always serious, it's not. Back in the late 1970s, Geoff, you took a certain ride.
On a Texan roller coaster. With my tape recorder.
And we're away! I didn't have time to say anything, and now we're going back down again. Faster and faster. Backwards, over the loop. Upside down. Over we go. Down again. And back. Along. Through. Rolling down. Up the other side. Slow right down. The brakes go on. We go down again. Faster and faster. Slow right down. And...
I should now try and explain, shouldn't I? It was a roller coaster which you sat in the truck, and it fired you forward up, and then you went back and you went over and up again, back on the other side, and then back over again and up again, and stopped. And I saw it and I thought, I just want to go on this with the tape recorder, and I'm not going to think about it. I just say, I want to go on it. So the management sat me there with the cassette machine jammed in between my knees, the microphone held against my chest, and I can't remember the name of the lady who was next to me, New Zealand journalist, and you heard her screaming. And I played it back down the phone, and they played it next morning on Morning Report. And her father said, "That's our Susie. I know that scream anywhere." This is the one. Ko te pūrongo o te atane ki runga te reo irirenga o Aotearoa. Tuesday, April the 1st. Ko Geoff Robinson tēnei.
Ko Simon Mersep tēnei. Coming up in this hour, Japan is ordered to stop whaling in the Antarctic. We'll hear from the Australian who led the case in court. And we've been bringing you highlights of Geoff's career this morning. I'm very honoured to be the last presenter presenting with Geoff Good Morning Report. He's worked with more than 30 co-presenters since the programme first went to air, including these three.
He is continuity at its best.
You can listen really well when you're calm, and I think that's what Geoff sort of, if he did anything with me, taught me to calm down and listen a bit harder.
A fine person and a fine broadcaster.
Kim Hill, Sean Plunket and Lyndsay Perigo there. We'll hear more from Kim and Sean after Radio New Zealand News with Nicola Wright. We've been bringing you highlights of what you've heard over the 4 decades of Geoff's broadcasting career this morning. If you've ever been interviewed by him, just before the interview starts, here's what you'll have heard.
Here we go, button pushed and recording now.
And we'll hear a few more tricks of his trade from his former co-presenters Kim Hill and Sean Plunket later this hour. But we'll get on with some news first. Japan says it will abide by an International Court of Justice ruling which orders it to cease whaling in the Antarctic, but some conservationists are sceptical of their promise. The International Court, which sits in The Hague, ruled overnight that the Japanese whaling program didn't meet scientific criteria and it should stop granting new permits for the killing, taking and treating of whales. The spokesperson for Japan's delegation, Nori Shikata, says they're disappointed by the court's decision but will abide by it. But speaking to me earlier this morning, Mr. Shikata was guarded on whether whaling programs would continue elsewhere.
We are disappointed and regret that the court ruled that Japan's research whaling program in the Antarctic did not fall within the special permit clause of the treaty. However, Japan will abide by the judgment of the court as a state that places a great importance on the international legal order and the rule of law as a basis of the international community.
How likely is it that Japan would now look to increase its whaling in other parts of the world?
As you are aware, we have other programs in the Northern Pacific. Japan's research whaling in the Northern Pacific is outside the scope of the proceedings before the court, which dealt with Japan's program in the Antarctic. But Japan will continue to contribute to the conservation and management of whale resources in full accordance with international law and based on science.
Well, Phil Peterson is the bosun on board the Bob Barker anti-whaling ship currently docked in Wellington. While delighted with the decision, he's reserving judgment on the Japanese response.
It's a huge day. We're all kind of now wondering, what's next? Are they actually going to follow through, with the decision? Everything that we've heard is saying they're going to. And from our point of view, it's hard to trust them.
Well, Australia brought the legal challenge against Japan. It was the first time any country had used an international court to try to stop whaling. Mark Dreyfus is Australia's former Attorney-General and represented Australia in the whaling case against Japan. He's with us in the Auckland studio. Good morning, Mr. Dreyfus.
Good morning.
Where does this court's ruling sit with you? Are you someone who is overwhelmingly approving of it, or are you also, like some we've just been hearing, perhaps a little reserved?
Australia is very, very pleased with this decision. It means that Japan's whaling programs, under which thousands of whales have been killed in the Southern Ocean, have at last been brought to an end. And as the introduction just told us then, Japan has been ordered to revoke all of the special permits that it had issued in relation to its current programs and not issue any further permits under those programs. The issue that remains is Japan's going to abide the decision of the court. Japan's, as the court said in its judgment, going to have to read the reasons of the court, and our hope is that Japan will work with Australia and other nations on non-lethal research in the Southern Ocean.
Well, how hopeful are you of that?
Well, it's a matter for discussion. Japan's a very fine international citizen. We know in Australia that there are a whole range of non-lethal methods. Scientists at the Antarctic Division operating out of Hobart have recently developed satellite tracking devices that can be implanted on whales that have, in the last couple of years, taught us a huge amount more about the habits and lives of whales in the Southern Ocean. We'd be hoping that Japan will join that sort of research.
Could a win for the anti-whaling lobby in the Antarctic be a loss for whales in the Northern Pacific, where Japan also carries out whaling?
Our case was about the whaling activities in the Southern Ocean, and I'm not going to comment on what implications there might be for the Northern Pacific, but again, we'd be hoping to see whaling end. We said in court that what Japan was doing was commercial whaling cloaked in the lab coat of science. The court has agreed with us, and as we stand here now, Japan won't be continuing those scientific programs in the Southern Ocean. That's something to be very pleased about. I know that almost everybody in New Zealand, certainly almost everybody in Australia, is thrilled by this decision. It's something that ends more than 2 decades of dispute with Japan and 3 years of very hard work on the case.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Dreyfus. Mark Dreyfus, Australia's former Attorney-General and representing the country in the court case against Japan in The Hague. It's 8:14.
New Zealand will face more floods, droughts, wildfires and damaging storms in future, and the country is poorly prepared. That's the conclusion of a landmark report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, focusing on vulnerabilities and adaptations to global warming. Scientists say part of the problem is a lack of research funding and too little support for local councils, but the government says it's addressing both those issues. Here's our science reporter William Ray.
Right now, all's calm at Island Bay on Wellington's south coast. But last June, a fierce storm tore into the capital and giant waves smashed down the seawall, which once stood where I'm standing now. But according to the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, floods, droughts and storm surges, like the one which hit here last year, will become more severe and more common. And Judy Lawrence from Victoria University's Climate Change Research Institute says that same report shows New Zealand isn't prepared.
I think we've got a pretty patchy picture, really, of where the highest risks lie. We've got lots of different reports, but nothing with a national sort of overview of where the problems are.
Another Victoria University climate scientist, James Renwick, agrees the new report reveals a lack of research into the effects of global warming on New Zealand.
It says in the filling knowledge gaps section that the literature is notably sparse in New Zealand. Now, talking about ecosystems particularly, but it's true, the literature is actually pretty sparse in New Zealand.
Dr Renwick says he's still surprised the government decided against making climate change one of its national science challenges.
It has been suggested that climate change infuses many of the national science challenges, and that's true to a certain extent, but for what's been identified as the biggest issue facing humanity, it does strike me as odd there isn't a specific science challenge around climate change.
The report says while adaptation planning is being done in New Zealand, most of the time it hasn't been implemented. Planning for sea level rise in particular is piecemeal and often challenged in the courts. The President of Local Government New Zealand, Lawrence Yule, says the problem is that local councils are shouldering too much of the burden for adaptation.
Without any central government directive, it is quite difficult for councils to do what effectively might be the right thing for the future, but is seen as being too aggressive for the people of the present. It's one of the most significant issues that it is faced by New Zealand, particularly in coastal communities, and we're never going to solve it by local government alone. It is going to have to be local government working with central government with an agreed framework, with some agreed timeframes to try and work this out.
The Climate Change Minister, Tim Grosser, says the government has no plans to introduce national directives for adaptation.
We still think it's better to give generalised approaches and let local communities work through that process within their own democratic frameworks. Having said that, we are going to continue to put out information that will try to focus people's minds on the need to start taking this issue more seriously.
Tim Grosser says the government also plans to fund more research into what parts of the country are most vulnerable to climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's next report, focusing on reducing and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, will be made public in 2 weeks. For Morning Report, William Ray.
8:18. A Northland iwi says it will continue fishing the way it's always done and ignore new rules on fishing for snapper, which are now in place. Restrictions on the number of snapper you can catch and an increase in how big they must be apply from today. Muriel Baker reports.
The daily bag limit for recreational fishers has been cut from 9 to 7, and all snapper must now be at least 30 centimetres long, up from 27 centimetres. The changes apply to those on the east coast, from the Bay of Plenty to the far north. When the announcement was made in September last year, the Northland iwi, Ngāti Kahu, warned that it would refuse to obey the new rules. The chief executive of Te Runanga a Iwi o Ngāti Kahu, Anahera Herbert Graves, says they are sticking by that.
No, nothing has changed, and yes, that is still the plan. Our hapu have been here for around 45 generations, so we see no need to change the way we're doing what we've always done.
Anahera Herbert Graves says Māori fish for a feed, not recreationally, and they know how to manage their own fisheries. The inshore fisheries manager for the Ministry for Primary Industries, Steve Halley, says there will be a leniency period for fishers to get used to the new rules.
we'll be looking at each case on its merits, and it depends on the extent of the offending as to whether and what penalties are applied. In the first case with minor offending, when rules change like this, we're going to be focusing primarily on education. But if you're significantly exceeding the rules, then you can expect us to take a tougher stance.
The Primary Industries Minister, Nathan Guy, has said the changes are aimed at building up stocks in affected areas. But Keith Ingram, who is part of the government working group and a former president of the Recreational Fishing Council, isn't convinced. Mr Ingram says many fish thrown overboard don't survive being released.
Recreational fishers are going to be creating a huge waste by releasing perfectly eatable fish, and all we're doing is creating a waste, and that's just going to drive the fishery down. And we have no evidence at the moment that will suggest that recreational released fish will survive to rebuild the fishery, and that's my greatest concern.
The new size limit does not apply to the commercial fishing industry, which is still allowed to catch 25-centimetre snapper. Richard Baker from the advocacy group Legacy says that's disappointing.
It's now illegal for the people to catch snapper under 30 centimetres, whereas it's still legal for the commercial sector to harvest them and sell them to the public. And we've still got trawlers ploughing around our fisheries that are killing tens of thousands of juvenile fish every year.
The penalties for breaking the new rules include fines of up to $20,000 and the forfeiture of vessels. Fisheries officers have been out and about warning people of the new changes, and signs and brochures will be updated to include the new rules. For Morning Report, Muriel Baker.
It's 8:21. Back now to our coverage of this day being the last day of Geoff Robinson being the presenter of Morning Report and his retirement today from Radio New Zealand.
Oh, am I going?
I think you are. Well, unless you're changing your mind. Is there a cup of tea coming, is there? Geoff, no, it's fair to say that Geoff's dignity and sense of occasion have seen him often take the role of anchor or presenter at many memorial services and state occasions. He did this job at the memorial services for those who died at Cave Creek, and as we heard earlier, for the victims of the Christchurch earthquake. He's also been Radio New Zealand's presenter at Sir Charles Upham's funeral service, the tangi for Te Ariki Nui Dame Te Ata I Rangi Kahu, and in 2008 for the nation's farewell to Sir Edmund Hillary.
And the procession turns and is ready to head from St Mary's Church. The strains of the piper come through the door. Sergeant Mansfield Murray of the Air Force, part of the Defence Force, playing Abide With Me, as slowly, swaying slightly from side to side, the casket is carried from the church in procession. It's interesting hearing that again. I hadn't realised quite how hushed my voice was, but then I was in the church. We were broadcasting from the gallery at the back of the cathedral, so I'm looking down at the ceremony in front of me, and also watching a television of the picture on the forecourt. So as the procession passed out through the door and they put the casket onto the hearse, a brand new one. I remember talking to the chauffeur; he told me it was brand new on that occasion. It's an intriguing thing, doing those kinds of things. It really is a privilege, because you're there bringing a story to the nation, and you have to have a sense of occasion, of the drama, of the theatre of it, and try and tell that story, because while the sound tells a story, sometimes the commentary just adds a little bit extra. I remember with the Christchurch Memorial, which was in Hagley Park, and in many ways, it was more like a royal visit than a memorial, because Prince William was there, and a lot of people had turned out for it. There was a kind of picnic atmosphere, but there were thousands of people in the park. And how do you tell how big a crowd is? Paul Holmes was doing commentary on his radio station. I was doing ours for National, and we had a sort of chat before. What are we going to say? And we just found a number.
You agreed on one.
So many thousands. We'll both say it was that at that time. And in the end, well, it was the police who worked out how many there were. I'm afraid I can't remember, but it was Yeah, it was.
And we mentioned a few there, Geoff, of the different services. What remains in your memory of some of these other services that you've covered?
Well, Charles Upham's was the most poignant, I think, because there were other old servicemen there in the Christchurch Cathedral, and you couldn't help thinking, hey, for many of them, next time they're in church, they'll be the one in the casket. So that was the most poignant. Charles Bennett's, the most difficult technically, that was up at the Marae at Rotorua. Ed Heller's was the most normal, I think, in many ways. David Long's was the oddest, I think, not least because of the venue, which was a rugby league ground, and Paul Reeves was the most religious. But I'd have to say Dame Teata's was the most chaotic, the most Maori occasion, quite something.
All right, it's 8:25. Now, I had the privilege of working with Geoff the last 3 years, just over 3 years. Many other presenters have joined him to bring you Morning Report for much longer than I, and two of them are with us this morning, with us in Wellington. Sean Plunket. Good morning, Sean. Welcome.
Good morning. Lovely to be back.
And also in Auckland this morning, Kim Hill. Hello, Kim.
Hi, how are you, Simon?
Well, we're well. We're taking a few minutes to reflect with you and Sean about working with Geoff and his contribution to New Zealand broadcasting, Kim.
I thought that that you might be piped out of the studio this morning, Geoff. Not that your casket's anytime soon, but a bit of pipes would be in fitting.
I would have to say that my belief in bagpipes is they're best heard on a hill a long way away.
It's an
but thank you for the thought.
Historic occasion. In future years, you'll be remembered for I'll be remembered for having been present when you retired, actually. It's a sort of a landmark occasion, the Water Cronkite of New Zealand.
I remember with you the interview with Pick Borta.
Oh,
you remember the time the South Africans had come here and they had this big meeting with Jim Bolger, apartheid was ending and so on, and he came into the studio. They were, I think, a little bit hungover. They'd had a bit of a drink with the government the night before. And I've forgotten what it was you said to him, but it was enough to really annoy him.
Something about Namibia, I believe.
Yes. How do we know we can trust you?
I know, but you were always there, Geoff, the calm centre of the universe. Like the tweets you've got and the emails, I've just been looking at them, they're an avalanche of affection. My particular favourite, actually, is if Geoff goes, who will do the bird call?
I don't think I've ever done a bird call.
No, I can tell you, Geoff, one of my great disappointments was when we stopped saying what the bird was.
Yeah.
Because to me that was the big thing, to be able to announce the bird call to the nation. Bugger the news, what was going on? But knowing what the bird was before the bird came on was like this, you were really in the inner sanctum.
The Pipi Wharaura.
Right, that's right, the Pipi Wharaura. And you probably know them all by heart now. But I was just thinking about what Kim was saying about, calmness and everything, Geoff, and you really are a fantastic person to co-present with. Because there's this kind of, you don't fear failing too much because if you're co-presenting with Geoff and something goes wrong or sideways, Geoff will just slot in there and he'll pick up the pieces and move the program forward. And it gives you, as a co-presenter, an incredible sense of security.
Yeah, he's the big safety net when you're a trapeze artist. Sure.
And I always remember, Geoff, an interview, I had been up, I think, loosening the lips of a source on the Winston Peters Select Committee inquiry story, and I had been loosening the lips of that source literally all night, and I turned up and you looked at me as if to say, well, my boy, we all know what you have been doing, but I said, we have to get Peters on. We have to get Peters on, and Peters wasn't giving interviews, and I said, let's get Jones on to say something outrageous, and then Peters will get on. And you sat there calmly as I, like a maniac and probably still slightly fueled by some single malt, managed to achieve this. And we got Peters on, and I think we pretty well nailed him on that interview. And I think it was the one compliment I got out of you, but I wasn't sure if it's for the quality of the journalism or the interview. And you said, that was quite remarkable.
Well, I must say that, and the other attribute you have is that ability to catnap, which I really do admire. You'd sit here in the studio, I'd think he'd be gone. He'd just sleep, his head would drop nearer and nearer to the table, and you'd think, he's never going to wake up. But then the interview would come and
bang,
he'd be there.
Yeah, that's right. It was
coiled spring.
Yes, and to give you, I knew you were occasionally sort of a little bit worried, but I don't think I ever missed one. I don't think I ever missed one.
Never did.
Yeah, so we got.
I don't think I ever had to actually prod you. You always woke up in time.
Yeah.
We've all talked about how you've been, the stable force and the whole melee, Geoff, but have you ever been terribly worried? Let's focus on Sean and myself. Have you ever been terribly worried? Apart from Sean not waking up in time, do you ever feel like, you've had enough of being there while we all lose our minds.
You in turn have been the safety blankets for me. I mean, that's the thing. I've known I haven't had to carry the whole damn thing on my own because there's always two people to share it. And I think that's really quite an important thing because it's 3 hours, it's pretty high pressure at times, it's pretty tense stuff we do, and we do share, we do rely on each other.
I'll tell you what, I was thinking, who would I really hate to interview? Probably you, Geoff, and I laughed. There was a piece in The Listener the other day, and I can remember doing an interview with you with Newsboy, or one of those newfangled programs for young people.
Yes, that tall guy, but Jeremy someone.
You are so good at flat batting people in interviews. And I read The Listener thing, I said, yeah, Geoff just was not playing the game that day, and we've done a couple of interviews together over the years, and you are just brilliant at not giving an answer. You would be the meanest person to interview as a Morning Report interview subject, I would imagine, ever possible.
Yeah.
Kim, would you take that on?
Would I take on interviewing Geoff?
Yes.
No, I'm with Sean on that. Way too hard.
Well, thank you both. I think it's a compliment.
You think?
I'll take it as one anyway.
Well, can I just say too, it was lovely to hear, and Kim, lovely to have you here thinking back to that 9/11 day, and as you said, probably the most significant, and I just so got what you said about coming down hard. I can remember going home, and I don't know how long we were on air for, and it was just a maelstrom, but I can remember going home and literally watching the TV and just tears rolling down my face, but it had still been professionally an amazing morning, and you kind of put the emotion aside, and then it comes back when you're done, doesn't it?
You do the job, don't you?
Yeah.
Thank you both very, very much for joining us today.
Well, Simon, your departure's a little overshadowed by your colleague,
yeah, that's
Geoff,
right.
what's his name, but you're not.
That's all right.
You're not going to get the chance to improve your golf game. You'll be back in the afternoon, so I wish you well too.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you, Kim Hill. Thank you, Sean Plunket, for coming in and sharing some thoughts.
Thank you, Geoff Robinson, for all the years.
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. Now, one more thing to say. Geoff, who's left for you to interview? Perhaps a sitting US president would still be on Geoff's list.
That would be nice.
Yeah, I think in 2008, of course, you were over in the United States for that campaign when Barack Obama eventually got elected, and this was some of Geoff's his report from the Washington D.C. on that occasion.
It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
I'm actually standing in the corridor outside the ballroom where the party is being held because there's so much noise in there you can barely hear yourself think. It was 2 minutes past 11 local time. That's about 14 minutes ago that the first of the big screens predicted the Obama win. The numbers came up, 284, 146, and the sound was terrific. There must be about 3,000 or 4,000 people in this ballroom, and they just let rip, hooted, cheered. There were people hugging, kissing, crying, almost every emotion you could imagine in front of me here. They are so excited.
I must, it was just that the whole building jumped when the news came through. They were waiting for it. They knew it was going to happen. I think that everybody had that feeling that Obama was going to win. There was no way that I can't even think who his opponent was. Isn't that dreadful?
The second...
John McCain. There was no way he was going to win. But everyone in the Democratic Party headquarters it was a magic evening, and it was a real thrill to be there.
And a real piece of history to be reporting on. Thank you. Okay, we will get back to normal programming now for just a moment anyway, and get a market update with Sharon Brett Kelly in Auckland. Hi there, Sharon.
Thank you, Simon. Wall Street has risen, led by technology and financial shares after comments from Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen. Ms. Yellen said the US Central Bank's extraordinary commitment to boosting the economy, especially the still struggling labour market, will be needed for some time to come. She hinted that interest rates would remain at near zero levels for an extended period. The Dow Jones, Nasdaq and S&P 500 indexes all rose about 1%. The NZX 50 index slipped 3 points yesterday to 5,140. The New Zealand dollar is at 86.73 US cents, 93.57 Australian, 52.04 pence, 89.53 yen, 0.6297 euro and 5.39 renminbi.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now, still to come before 9 o'clock on Morning Report, we'll speak to one of the lucky 950 New Zealanders who's had their name pulled out of the ballot for a place at the centenary service at Gallipoli next year.
Time to say sport with Gary Hearn. I was just thinking, Gary, I've been saying that to you for an awful long time. We go back 1975?
Well, I was just going to say, Geoff, as Barack Obama mentioned a few minutes ago, it's been a long time coming, hasn't it? And it's been fantastic being alongside you for so long.
Oh, well, thank you for all the
studio.
It's been great.
All the very best in your retirement. Leave it a couple of months, though, before you get stuck into the bathroom and the bedroom, won't you? The Black Caps bowling coach Shane Bond says they cracked under pressure of a must-win match and concedes their problems with chasing totals is cause for concern. New Zealand failed miserably in their attempt to reach the semi-finals of the 2020 World Cup, losing to Sri Lanka by a humiliating 59 runs in their final group game in Bangladesh. Chasing a modest 119, the Black Caps capitulated to be all out for just 60, their lowest ever T20 total. Bond says there are no excuses for what he describes as an unacceptable performance.
If you're honest with it, we just played some poor cricket. We put ourselves under pressure, and the times that we needed to stand up when the pressure was at its highest in the tournament, we just didn't get the job done. And the concern here was that we sort of folded under when we were batting second. So that's probably something we need to look at. I mean, at the end of the day, we didn't deserve to make the semi-finals playing like that.
Shane Bond, Sri Lanka will face the winner of tomorrow morning's final Group 2 match between Pakistan and the defending champions, the West Indies, in the semi-finals. The White Ferns tournament also ended frustratingly. Their last over loss to South Africa meant they missed out on their semi-finals. South Africa and Australia going through with superior run rates. Family and friends of the young Newcastle Knights League forward Alex McKinnon are hopeful his condition will eventually improve as he recovers from surgery and starts to receive intensive treatment on the severe spinal injuries he suffered 8 days ago. 22-year-old McKinnon suffered 2 broken vertebrae when he was tackled by 3 Melbourne Storm opponents, and he and his family have been told he's a quadriplegic, though his condition could improve with treatment and time. Newcastle's coach Wayne Bennett has reported to have visited McKinnon yesterday in Melbourne's Alfred Hospital. Another third-quarter meltdown has kept the Central Pulse winless in Australia, and shooter Donna Wilkins says until they address the problem, they'll struggle to make an impact in the Trans-Tasman Netball Championship. The Wellington-based side were beaten 63-45 by the New South Wales Swifts in Sydney, leaving them with just 2 wins from 5 games and in 6th place in the 10-team competition. The Pulse were outscored 17-9 in the third stanza, and Wilkins concedes the third-quarter capitulations are crushing their chances.
You look at the first half of the game and we were there or thereabouts. The first quarter we were only down by 1 and only 6 at half time. And, again, the third quarter, it killed us last week and the same thing this week. So, we have to go back and have a look whether or not we made too many changes or what we were doing differently. And, we need to fix that third quarter up.
Donna Wilkins, meanwhile, the mainland Tactics remain anchored at the bottom of the table after a 67-43 loss to the Melbourne Vixens in Christchurch. That's sport.
Thank you very much, Gary. I've also enjoyed working with you over the last 3 years or so. Cheers to you. It's 18-9. Anzac Day is just a little over 3 weeks away, but for 950 New Zealanders, it's next year's Anzac Day which is uppermost in their thinking. Yesterday, they found out they'd been chosen in a government ballot to attend the 2015 centenary commemoration of the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign in Turkey. Each can take one other person with them. The expected high interest in the centenary led the Turkish government to limit the number of New Zealanders and Australians who are allowed to attend. But one of those chosen in the ballot is Kirsty Cameron from Auckland, and she's with us. Good morning, Kirsty.
Oh, good morning, Simon.
What does it mean to you to be able to go to Gallipoli next year?
I think I'm still trying to sort of process the feelings. I mean, obviously very excited, but also very moved because I'll be travelling with my father, who'll be nearly 80, and he is the grandson, and I'm the great-granddaughter of Charles Armitage O'Neill Cowan, who was shot through the thigh and the chest, but survived at Gallipoli.
And has this been something that you've just long wanted to do?
Well, yes, I have. I've always, it's one of those bucket list things. I would love to see Gallipoli, and when the ballot came up, I rang Dad and said, well, I'll throw my name in and you put your name in and we'll see what happens. I mean, Charles Cowan had 6 children, so there's probably quite a few descendants and second cousins and third cousins who might have entered. You had to be from the direct line. And so we both put our names in and actually we both got drawn. So it's wonderful because I think I have 2 sisters and it may turn out with working out what we can do that perhaps all 4 of us get to go.
And just a quick word on your great-grandfather, Charles Cowan, Kirsty. I think you've made some comment about him when he got back to New Zealand after the campaign.
Well, I put it like this, Simon. I don't think he would have won a Father of the Year award. He was a Piha railway man. He left the bush. He spent a lot of time, he'd been in, I think, a naval reserve. And there is some suggestion he may have lied about his age and fought in South Africa even earlier. But he went off to Gallipoli. He was very badly injured. He ended up with one leg being a couple of inches shorter than the other. He was evacuated out to recuperated in England eventually. When he came home, I think he was with the family perhaps long enough for another child. There were 6 children ultimately. But then he pretty much abandoned his wife. And he actually he told the children she'd died. The children were all spread out. My grandmother was brought up by a sort of a maiden aunt, and her brothers and sisters were all separated. And he ended up running, basically leaving them all in New Zealand, and he ran a trading boat around the islands in the Pacific with a
Goodness
cousin.
me. Such is family history.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Kirsty Cameron from Auckland, who'll be going to Gallipoli next year for the centenary commemorations. It's 8:45 now. Well, back to Mr. Robinson now. Now, being a presenter on Morning Report does allow you access to places most people don't get to. And then we have the privilege of telling you about it. In 2002, Geoff was the first New Zealand broadcaster to be invited to North Korea.
Well, it was a highly structured visit. I was part of a delegation which travelled with the New Zealand ambassador who was presenting his credentials to the government there. As part of that visit, we were taken to the Great Memorial to Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. It's a giant statue of Kim standing there with his right hand reaching out in front of him, overcoat, what we used to call a Mao jacket underneath, and across this wide courtyard on either side of which, up like ship's prows, are statues, and on either side of the statues a frieze of sculptures. Pyongyang is an unusual place, to say the least. The thing I remember about the roads is that they were very empty. There were very smart traffic police ladies with a big whistle, but there was very little for them to actually direct around the place. And they took us to the mausoleum, and the mausoleum where Kim Il-sung is lying in state was a cathedral in red marble.
Wow.
Beautifully polished red marble, but it was as big as any cathedral I've ever been in. And as well as that, we're taken to his birthplace. We saw the place he lived in and the school he went to, and they're very proud of their founding father and his philosophy. But it certainly was a very unusual place to be.
And Geoff, speaking of places many people don't get to go to, with all the airline security these days.
Yeah, that's right.
You wouldn't get to go to where you were, and it was at 1997.
1997, I was actually in the cockpit of an Air New Zealand jumbo jet as it landed at Heathrow Airport in London. The runway has just come into sight ahead of us. The lights are lit. It's a very grey day in London, and it seems to be just slightly to the left as we approach. Captain now has the controls. I said he had the controls, but actually he didn't. His hand was hovering just above the controls, and the plane landed itself.
Wow.
It was magic. And then you're on Heathrow Airport in this enormous aeroplane looking for the place to park. And they had to have a map out. They literally got a map out of the airport, and a voice in our headphones was saying, "You go to so-and-so, terminal such and such and such and such." We said, "Where on earth's that?" And everyone on the control deck was looking at the map trying to work out where it was.
Geoff, I have to tell you that our email inbox is bursting to overflowing this morning, as it has been on other days. But I'll just give you an example of some of the messages that have come through today. Listen to this. "I've woken up to your musical voice for the whole of my married life, wherever I've been in New Zealand. Your steady contribution to putting the news into calm, detached perspective has been much appreciated. As you enter the next phase of your life, I hope you will learn to sleep in every day, enjoy breakfasts with your family, and have lots of fun. And I expect to wake up, not too early, in our camper van someday, somewhere in New Zealand, to hear your dulcet tones in a camping ground at some beautiful place as you appreciate a beautiful sunrise. Very best wishes, Ray and Trevor."
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll just quickly mention one other. We have never met, but you have been part of my life since I was a little girl recently arrived in New Zealand from Leeds, Yorkshire in 1975. I think my earliest memory of Morning Report was 1977, when I still remember stepping out of the shower to hear about the Erebus crash. One of those moments which is etched in your brain forever. Apart from my husband, you are the only bloke who has been in my bedroom every morning for as long as I can remember. Thank you for being a part of my life for so long. I hope you have a lovely, long and happy retirement. Aroha nui, Mr. Voice. And that is from Sarah Wallace.
There is that peculiar thing about what we do, that you are in bed with people. It's strange. It's a privilege. Thank you for inviting me in. Can I put it that way?
Pleasure is all theirs. Now, Geoff, it's 11 minutes to 9, and I have to say that every now and then you get to interview someone you've long admired, and for Geoff, it was this man.
Jacques Cousteau, the name internationally synonymous with underwater exploration and conservation of the world's marine resources. In New Zealand with Calypso for several months of filming that'll go toward a major Rediscovering the Planet project, Jacques Cousteau has left Calypso this morning to join us in the studio. Welcome. 10 years ago you said that the ocean was sick, very sick. Is it any better now?
Oh, no. Of course not.
That was quite something. I mean, he'd been one of those childhood heroes. I'd grown up on the television programme, The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, in black and white on the old grainy television we used to have then. And there was this man, that unassuming gentleman, sitting in front of me, playing with a pile of airline tickets, because in those days we had tickets. You didn't log in electronically. And he said he was keeping them to see how big the pile got over the course of the year. It was, I think, around about March when I spoke with him, and his pile was already an inch thick, so heaven knows what it had been like at the end of the year. He was a very nice man. It was a nice interview. I enjoyed that.
Very much so. Geoff, you always, of course, hope the interviewees will turn up on time. But I think sometimes they can be a little too on time. Is that right?
Yes, you're talking about the Dalai Lama. He made his first visit to New Zealand in 1992, and I went up to his hotel to interview him. We'd been up the day before to set everything up, and I was crawling under the table to plug in the lead for the interview. And as I sort of backed out and turned round, there was this nice, smiling man with glasses and a brown blanket over his shoulder coming towards me with his hand out, the Dalai Lama.
We've been asked why you wanted to come here. It said that your eyes lit up when someone said, when you were invited to come here, you said you always wanted to come to New Zealand.
Yes, I always consider myself as a citizen of this world. So the visitors in new places, I always say interesting, and to see a new place and new people, new culture.
Dalai Lama. It was quite. I had to leave the studio and go up there during the programme to do the interview.
Wow, Geoff, I'll just time to mention a couple of other emails that have come in, and there are many of them this morning. I wish New Zealand journalism could bottle you and stop the out to get you and want to score a point attack version of journalism adopted by those without your qualities. Enjoy your retirement and your lie-ins. That's a nice thought. And another one, I grew up in a home where Morning Report was always in the background, and now my 19-month-old daughter has the same soundtrack. Mind you, her favourite bit is the bird, of course. So go well, Geoff. I will miss the humour in your voice at the more absurd news items, but have faith that the new team will continue the standard of excellence we are accustomed to. Thank you, from Meredith van Beekhuizen. Now, even the most professional interviewer can get put off sometimes.
What are you going to do now?
Well, I think there was a certain chap you were interviewing who wouldn't leave the studio back in 1976. We're talking about the comedian Spike Milligan.
Potato butter. Agriculture ministers of the common market countries are meeting in Brussels today. The main item on their agenda is New Zealand butter. Specifically, the quantities that Britain should be allowed to import between 1978 and 1980.
More butter.
Well, our correspondent in Brussels, one Marion Bywater, sent us a preview of the meeting, and we're going to read it for you.
The European Commission is expected to ask the member states...
Quite a character, Spike Milligan. I did the famous interview with him, and a couple of years later... he came out to visit New Zealand again, and I passed him on the corridors of Broadcasting House, and he picked up a conversation we've been having about rugby exactly as if no time had passed since the time before, and said, did he ever tell me about his time playing rugby in the desert in World War II? I said, no. He said, well, we used to stop at half-time and have a beer. and what our hooker used to do, he said, was to get a couple of bottles of beer and tie them to the tags of his shorts and stick them down inside his shorts. And the first scrum after half-time, he'd put a hand up on one trouser leg and pull out a beer and offer it to his opposite number. It worked every time, he said, to actually stop the game and we'll go on score. Yeah, Spike Milligan. Extraordinary.
Now, Catherine Ryan, hello, good morning. Yesterday you had the opportunity to spend, I think, about nearly an hour talking to Geoff, and it's nice to have you back again this morning.
I got nowhere, did I? I heard you and Kim this morning discussing it.
I thought I gave everything.
Oh, you gave and gave, Geoff.
Yes.
The first thing you did, actually, was issue an opinion. And as you always do, I got off air and kicked myself and said, why didn't you ask for some more? You came on and said you think the parliamentary term's too long. And what I should have said is, and what else, Geoff? What else would you like to unleash on us now? What other views?
Well, now at that moment I had the chance to be myself rather than be a professional broadcaster.
Are you a person? Are you a person of strong opinions and passions that you just professionally manage?
Not strong, no, not really. I'm quite whatever that word is.
Yeah. We'll get it between us, shall we? Yeah.
Well, think about it. Tell us what's coming up on your programme.
I don't want to use up much time. We're going to talk about the whaling decision, speak to some of those who took the court case in the first place. Will this be the end of whaling in the Antarctic? Trying to obviously now work out what Japan's next move might be. Also going to speak to one of the leading lights for DOC's partnerships in the community's volunteer group, Friends of Flora, saying it's overwhelmed by the task of trying to keep pests under control, and saying that DOC, while doing its best, is having to rely too heavily on volunteers and outside partnerships. And our guest after 10, the Nigerian author, playwright, theatre and film writer, Biyi Bandele. Oh, Geoff, I'm going to miss seeing you at 8:45 every morning. I'm going to miss you as much as everyone else is. I do think one of our listeners yesterday had the best idea when they said Geoff should record the bird calls so that we can hear his voice every morning.
Well, it's very sweet, thank you.
We have plans for you too, but more on that later.
Oh, there's another chapter
they have let me choose
the
bird call today. But anyway, it's time for Te Mana Kōrahi news. Here's Ererere Kura. No, it's not. They're not even letting that happen.
No, I think we're going to carry on and talk about you. It's all about you, Geoff. We'll get back to it another time.
Have a bit of peace and quiet.
It's nearly done. It's actually 4 minutes to 9 on Morning Report. Now, as we have been reporting this morning, it is Geoff's final day on Morning Report and at Radio New Zealand. I'm also moving on from this program. I will be presenting afternoons starting in a few weeks' time. We'd just like to say thank you to the people who've actually helped us put together all this wonderful archival sound we've heard this morning.
It's really quite extraordinary. I've heard things I have totally forgotten about. I know Kim Griggs has done an awful lot of work on it. Thank you very much, Kim, for all of that, and the people at Archives who presented it to you.
Indeed, it was indeed the Sound Archives, Ngā Taonga Kōrero, for their archival audio. You've heard it right through this morning from 6 a.m. We've been playing it. Also, thank you to the University of Auckland's Chapman Archive. Now, we've been reading out, Geoff, some of the texts and emails and written messages we've received from listeners from all over the country, and there have been many, many of them. But let's actually have a listen to one or two of your listeners.
It was kind of love at first listen, I suppose. I consider Geoff a kind of friend in a way, even though I've never met him nor he me.
Really, in the morning when you're trying to listen to the news, you don't need to turn the light on or anything. You just know that you've got the right channel because you've got Geoff Robinson's voice.
Geoff takes this as a compliment, but as an insomniac, I love the few minutes of sleep he gives me from about 5:45. I hear Geoff, I know all is well with the world, and promptly fall deeply asleep.
It's a really familiar voice. You know, it's one of the sounds that I do remember growing up as a child, and it is comforting almost, I guess, to have him on every morning as you walk into work.
I've been listening to Geoff Robinson for 33 years driving to work, and it's a long way to work. And I just think with his departure that driving to work will never be the same again.
I love his professionalism. He is a person who interviews exceptionally well. He never gets aggressive, but he always gets his point out, and he always gets the evidence from the interviewee every time.
He always sounds really calm, measured, a good interviewer.
I find his dulcet tones reassuring, even when he's talking about major awful news matters, but he can still make life seem calm and relaxing, just like listening to the cricket in the old days.
He is exceptionally well-mannered, he is exceptionally fair, he's outstanding, and I'll miss him.
I'll keep listening, but it's definitely going to be different. You know, his voice is what I associate with Morning Report.
If I could, you know, I'd listen to him basically for the rest of my life, but I realise that, all good things have got to come to an end, and he deserves a good break after the brilliant work he's done broadcasting from Radio New Zealand.
So go well, Geoff. Enjoy your next life.
After that, all I can say is I think I'll walk across the harbour on my way home.
Well, Geoff, I think the thing that comes through from all those comments is people who may not know you directly, but they think they know you, and they think they can trust you, and they think that they hear the empathy in your voice, your common sense, your fairness, composure, and sometimes there's many reasons why one might not be composed, but you maintain your composure and with a sense of grace. And I think that's what people are hearing, and that's why they've taken you into their lives every day.
Simon, enough. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you. Good luck with the next programme that you're moving on to. And just a last chance to thank my family for the support they've given me over the years, my co-workers, because it's been a terrific amount of work by other people that has enabled me to be successful, to have what I've had, to the listeners, because without you we wouldn't be here, and what we do for you. So you're the really important ones, and they've allowed me to choose the bird, my favourite bird call, the kōkako.
The kōkako. Radio New Zealand National.
Goodbye.